minute early. I declare open this hearing of the Senate Community Affairs Legislation Committee into the Aged Care and Other Legislation Amendment Royal Commission Response Number 2 Bill 2021. These are public proceedings and a Hansard transcript is being made, and the hearing is also being broadcast via the internet. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege, and it's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. The committee prefers all evidence to be public, although the committee may determine or agree to a request to have evidence heard in private session. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may also be made at any other time. The committee understands that all witnesses appearing today have been provided with information regarding parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses, and additional copies of that information can be obtained from the Secretariat. So I now welcome representatives from COTA Australia, the Older Persons Advocacy Network and the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia. So thank you very much for appearing before us today. Before we begin, could I ask you to please state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript? And I just mentioned, I don't think I actually acknowledged who I had online. I think we have Senator McLaughlin online, but by phone we have Senator Rice, the Deputy Chair of the Committee, and Senator Polly, and I'm not sure if I have any other. Senator Green, I'm assuming maybe on there, but hopefully we'll have a few different senators dropping in and out. So Senator Green's on there as well. So I'll now invite each of you to provide a brief opening statement, to introduce yourself with the name and capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript. We'll start with the COTA, if that's okay, Mr Yates.
Thank you, Senator. Ian Yates, Chief Executive of the Council on the Ageing, or COTA Australia.
Thank you very much. Older Persons Advocacy, Mr Gear.
Morning, Senator. Craig Gear, the CEO of the Older Persons Advocacy Network, also known as OPAM.
Thank you. And the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council. So we've got Ms Petitsos.
Good morning, Senator. Mary Petitsos. I'm the chairperson of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council of Australia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Ms Geronimo.
Good morning, Senator. I am Marianne Geronimo, Director of Policy on Health and Ageing at the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia.
Thank you, everyone, for doing that. So now I'll invite each of you to make a brief opening statement, should you wish to, and after that we'll invite the committee members to ask some questions. So we'll do it in the same order, if that's okay. Mr Yates, did you wish to make a statement?
Thank you, Senator, and thanks to the committee for the opportunity to both make a submission and to appear. Given that there are three organisations and that the number of measures covered in this bill is substantial, I will be brief and be happy to answer questions. But basically, as the committee would be aware, senators would be aware, this bill is the second in the government's responses to the Aged Care Royal Commission, and deals with matters that can't be, or that need legislative framework in order to be advanced ahead of the development and passage of a new Aged Care Act, which is slated for mid-2023. So each of the measures in this bill actually effectively create a framework which subordinate legislation will fill out. And quite a lot of the comments that in the submission put together by the COTA team relate to really those provisions and the process of getting there. We welcome the fact that the government has brought this many measures on this quickly, and we'll be urging the Senate to give this bill passage so that these can continue to be advanced as quickly. But we also think that it's important that as the government moves in each of these measures, it has a very active program of engagement of stakeholders, particularly consumer organisations, in that process. I don't want to comment on each of the measures, though I can, and I can say that most of them are matters not only that were raised by the Royal Commission, but indeed in many cases by previous inquiries, and are matters that we have been actively engaged in and advocating for some years, including in particular, I might just mention the screening of aged care workers and governing bodies, the need for some kind of code in the sector, the extension of incident management, not our terminology, but for home-based care. And it very, very dear to our hearts is the changes to governance arrangements for approved providers. Unfortunately, as the Royal Commission demonstrated so clearly, particularly in its first report, although this sector has many world-class providers, it also has far too many who are not. And we have recognised over the years that as much as you undertake enforcement procedures, you really do have to have measures that systemically try and address the need for providers themselves to take responsibility for the excellence of their programs. And governance is at the very peak of that. We used to think it was management, and it certainly is management, but management is appointed by and accountable to governance. So we really strongly welcome these measures and all the other measures. And I might say that the final one in this package of restrictive practices is also something that has been of concern to CODA for very many years, and we're pleased to see that recent developments start to address that in a much more robust way. Thanks, Senator.
Thanks, Mr Yates. Mr Gear from OPAN.
Thank you, Senators. OPAN is broadly supportive of the bill and as well would like to see passage of the bill. It's very important that the Royal Commission recommendations continue to progress and that there is strong engagement with the consumer sector as well around these reforms. And we thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Just highlighting probably a couple of comments through some of the measures. Those relating to the amendments to residential aged care funding, we are broadly supportive, but we would like some consideration for those who are unable to pay or socially economically disadvantaged and are vulnerable, that some of the measures around the charges and the waiving of charges need to take into account those who may be remote or are unable to pay, and that maybe equal access to respite care or other forms of care need to be ensured as well. We are supportive, again, of the screening of the workforce, and we think that it is a good measure for where it will sit and the obligations that are on both the providers and individual workers as well, and on management. In relation to the Code of Conduct and banning orders, we do see that as an important initiative, but there does need to be, I suppose, transparency in the banning orders. One of the areas of concern that's been raised with us, both in the banning orders of the code, but also with the issue of the screening, is access to that screening information for people who may be managing a self-managing their home care package, and that they should be able to have some level of access to knowledge of a banned worker or an issue with the Code of Conduct as well, which may not be as transparent if the Commissioner is just broadly putting it to the provider that there is a worker of concern. Those who are self-managing should have some level of access to that information as well. In relation to the governance model, we are very pleased that there is going to be this increased transparency and increased controls and expectations. There is some concern around the ability for providers to, I suppose, downgrade the size of their governance bodies to be able to go for the exemption or sit under the requirements to have the care governance committees, and so we think that that needs to be considered, that the application for an exemption should be transparent, but it should be only very rarely given. We have long been a supporter of the idea of the quality of care body, but also the idea of consumer advisory groups. We would have liked to see those legislated, the consumer advisory groups, but we are pleased that there's still measures in there that point to those as well. And we think that there needs to be regular reporting from those advisory groups, and a process that strongly encourages re-engaging with consumers around the wish for an advisory body, and that occurs on a regular occasion. We were supportive of an increase in nursing hours, particularly in line with Senator Patrick's recommendation, meaning around the 24 hours per day. And we do think there needs to be increased registered nurses providing care in residential aged care facilities. And finally, on the restrictive practices, we recognise there is a need for an interim measure with a sunset clause that helps clarify some of the requirements around who can consent in relation to restrictive practice. Thank you, Senators.
Thank you very much. Becca, would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you. And again, I'll try to be as brief as possible. So we're broadly in support, as is OPAN and COTA. Of course, many of us have asked for many of these things to be in place a while back. So this is all looking quite positive. The particular areas that we're concerned about, of course, from a call perspective, is the capability and the capacity of the sector to look after an increasing proportion of consumers who come from cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds. By that, we mean somewhere between, depending on how you measure, at a minimum 30 to what is sometimes described as 50% of the cohort of ageing populations, as we now experience the transition to older age of people who migrated after World War II. So we're not talking about a small sort of slither of the population. We're talking about a huge number with specific needs, and they're well recognised and well documented. So our concern has been the capacity of the sector to cater for that group of people as their needs move towards care, and before that, as older people trying to live in community. So for us, there's specific elements that we have. We foreshadowed to have some concern with, and really it's not because we don't support, but that we recognise that we need capability and capacity. Some of that is the capability and capacity of our ethno-specific providers to care for ethno-specific consumers. So we're really interested in reaching the endpoints that the bill tries to take us to, but to recognise that for ethno-specific organisations, and we may actually need to put in transition arrangements to ensure that their capability is not compromised, so that we don't have the unintended consequences. Their governance needs to be up to scratch, and their quality of care needs to be up to scratch, so everyone receives high quality care. But we do recognise that there is a capability issue in some of our smaller ethno-specific providers. In the same way as we see a population of consumers, so we do workforce. We have high proportions of called people working as caregivers in the sector, and if we are to work with that workforce, we need to ensure that there is no unintended consequences as we reform to having requirements on those care workers that places responsibilities on them and their employer to look after older people to the best of everybody's capacity. So for us, it's all about transition arrangements to make sure that there's no unintended consequences.
Thank you very much. So we might move to some questions, and I'll start with Senator Polly.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for appearing before us and your submissions. And Mr. Yates, in your submission, you discussed the concerns around the code of conduct and applying to non-approved aged care providers, often found in the Commonwealth Home Support Program and home care. For instance, a lawnmower from a local service provider. Can you expand onto this for us, please?
Thank you, Senator. I mean, we recognise that we're in a position of transition, and by mid-2023 we're going to have a single aged care home care program, supported home program. But at the moment we are in that transition, and as we move to do that, we'd like to see proportionate application of responsibilities. We also, in this submission, drawing attention to one of our considerable concerns, which is that the current arrangements for home care packages require that someone who is able to and wishes to self-manage their package is required to do so through a home approved provider, and that approved provider is responsible for the subcontractors, which significantly limits the capacity of the person to self-manage. Now, self-management is not for everybody, but it is for some, and it's something that the system ought to much more provide for. And our understanding is that work that's happening around the supported home program will be much more cognizant of and accommodating of that. But in that case, then we need to think about who is responsible in that sense for following. Well, the person is obviously responsible for following a code of conduct, but the managing person shouldn't be responsible for it. So we just are really pointing out that there needs to be quite a bit more exploration there of a whole sector of people who are providing important supports but are not providing clinical services.
Thank you. So we then need to be very mindful about choice and control by consumers themselves.
Yes.
But are there any safety and quality concerns and consequences that you wanted to add to, what you've already put into your submission?
There are obviously safety and quality concerns, but I think that what we're saying is these can be accommodated, and should be proportionate. And the person who is providing those services, whoever they are, ought to be following a proportionate code of conduct and ought to be accountable for it.
Your submission raises the individual civil penalties that may apply to workers for non-compliance with the code of conduct. What's your opinion on the penalties associated with non-compliance and how they relate to aged care workers' wages?
The team was concerned that they should be proportionate, and not. They should obviously have an effect. I mean, they should be discouraging. That would be the point, but that they should be proportionate, and that's something that should be looked at in the detailed design.
If I could then go to Older Persons Activist Network, if I can just ask a couple of questions around your submission. You discussed providing those who self-manage their home care package access to aged care screening database about a potential worker. Why is this so important, and how could this be done whilst maintaining privacy? You did allude to that in your opening comments, so can you elaborate for the committee?
Thanks, Senator. Yeah, so I think that the self-managed person is potentially at more arm's length to the provider, as Mr. Yates has highlighted, where the provider might still hold the package but not be doing the day-to-day management of that person. It is possible, though, if for a reverse declaration, where they declare that there is no concerns with the current workforce that are coming to the provider, from the provider or working with the provider under that model. So yes, there needs to be due process and protections of privacy, but just because somebody is self-managing shouldn't be that they're put at higher risk of someone breaching either the code of conduct or hasn't gone through the appropriate screening process. I think that, again, can come out in the design to make sure where there are flags, how those are communicated to those who are using a self-management process in their home care package.
Can I ask you then, for the benefit of the committee, what your view is on consultation around the proposed code of conduct, and who do you think needs to be consulted? Why is this important?
Senator, I think it is important that we always engage with older people who will be the recipients of care. And while there might be a basis to move from the NDIS model as well, I think it's important that older people are brought into the consultation, those with lived experience of working with this workforce, to be able to have a say of their expectations on that. I think that's organisations such as CODA, FECA and ourselves are very good at being able to support that sort of consultation. And we look forward to working with the department as this design phase occurs to be able to ensure that the code and the screening tool is actually going to meet the needs of older people and protect them from the risk of abuse.
Thank you for that. Your submission also raises concerns around the exemption provided to smaller providers in relation to governing body membership requirements. Can you expand a bit more on that for us, please?
Certainly. So I suppose in talking to older people on our National Older Persons Reference Group, some who have worked in the sector before could see the ways that some unscrupulous providers might try to get around the need for this, or to have a higher level of ability to apply for the exemption. And so we think that there does need to be some caps, and that the exemption is only used quite rarely. There may be times where, due to access or a remote care delivery model, or the facility being in a remote area, that it is a need to have a smaller level of board or governance committee. I think in those circumstances can be looked at, but in some ways that those areas may be the need for greater protections, not necessarily in size of governing body, but the capacity and skill. We do see that in remote locations where there is challenges getting to skill-based boards or boards with the clinical care. We also see that it needs to be around the social well-being of care as well, not just clinical in the medical sense of care. It needs to have a broad range of skills in that board as well. Hence why I think that the board size, governing body size, needs to be very carefully considered.
Is there a role for government to educate and get ready members of such boards? Because as you said, in some remote communities, but it can be the same out in regional areas where they don't have the necessary qualifications, and yet if there was some organisation that was prepared to put in some training for those positions, would that not be an advantage?
Absolutely, Senator. I think anyone on a governing body of an organisation needs to make sure that they're appropriately equipped to undertake their fiduciary duties and undertake their role and the broadness of their role, and appropriately supporting. I believe there have been some initiatives and some recommendations for the Royal Commission around that development of the skills-based board. I think that's important, that it's focused on the skills and maintaining those skills or upskilling those members. And we don't want to lose the community connection that sometimes occurs with those regional models, but we want to make sure that they have the same protections as larger providers as well. Training will help with that.
Thank you. Fenka, in relation to your submission, again, thank you for that. You raise some issues around the transitioning support for multicultural providers to improve the governance standards and to meet the new requirements. Is there anything that you want to add to your submission in terms of the type of support or concerns you may have, whether they're going to be ready? You're on mute.
Sorry, I like listening to myself and no one. So look, some of the issues that were just raised by Craig in regards to finding appropriate people for rural and remote areas. Obviously, for ethno-specific providers, if they are going back into their community to find directors, there may be inexperience in those particular groups. Well, not may, there is inexperience in those groups to understand the responsibilities that they have as directors on a board and how to meet their obligations. Their fiduciary duties are increasingly complex, and there are high risks for directors now who choose to be on aged care boards, as there are risks for directors who choose to be on NDIS boards, disability provider boards. So those responsibilities need to be understood, and they need to be, we need to find people who are interested in being trained up to take on those roles. And that's what we really are talking about at FECA, that we need to be able to have a transition period where we can actually encourage community members to undertake training, whether it's AICD or some other governance training, and ensure that when they join the board, that they are not just a very effective representative of their community and the consumers that they wish to care for, but that they understand the risks and responsibilities associated with that role. It's not something we can do overnight, and in many respects, there is much to do to lift the capacity of all directors who are on aged care boards. It's not limited to ethno-specific, but the specific nature of the groups we're talking about require additional attention. So that's really what we need to do, and that's why we need some time if we are going to increase the governance responsibilities, which are being increased anyway, because by increasing regulation, providers there are onerous responsibilities for providers, which, if they're not understood, could actually hold them personally liable. So it's not a little thing. FECA urges that attention be drawn to the importance of that.
Do you see your organisation as having a crucial role in that education, or do you see some responsibility on the Commonwealth Government?
I think there's responsibility on all of us. So I think the Commonwealth Government has responsibility to ensure that the providers have good governance arrangements. I think it's the responsibility of providers to fulfil their obligations, and it's the responsibility of peak organisations like us to facilitate outcomes for community, for consumers, and also make sure that ethno-specific providers do understand their. So I think we're all responsible. None of us, none of us are off the hook. So we each have a particular role. I think the importance for government is to understand that there probably needs to be some investment in this, and for providers to actually spend money on governance, training their directors. That each director should have a budget for personal training and development, and a requirement, like we do in the professions, that you are required to do, 10 or 15 hours of professional development as a board director, and that you have to sign off those hours and in order to remain eligible. That's where I think we should be heading. We just need time to get us there, and we need to not lose the good things that we have, which is people that believe in the community, want to do the right thing, all that kind of. We don't want to lose the good people at the expense of good governance, but we need good governance, so we need to get there.
Yes, thank you for that. The other area you touched on in your submission was around the code of conduct and banning orders. Could you just elaborate a bit further on your views in covering the code of conduct?
We support a really strong workforce that are adequately trained and do the right thing. And it's been a horrific experience going through the Royal Commission and looking at some of the poor quality care that we've seen and heard about. So while we absolutely support that, we recognise that providers are responsible for upskilling their workforce, and that some parts of that workforce are really vulnerable because of the nature of who they are. So some of them are visa holders, some of them are. So the people at the bottom end of our workforce are particularly vulnerable. So what we want to do is make sure that we, whether they're temporary migrants or visa holders or basically poor people doing work for very little pay and under insecure work arrangements, that we're able, if we introduce a code of conduct, to bring them up to capacity rather than discipline them before we do that. And employers have a really big responsibility to ensure that. And we have a workforce issue in this country. So the reality is that we need to incentivise capacity in our workforce, and to ensure that the providers take that responsibility, and not for it not to be punitive before we actually build that capacity. So the bottom end of our workforce is critical. They're the ones that spend the greatest amount of hours, greatest amount of time with our consumer. So if we build their capacity and the joy they have in their work, and we reward them properly, and we skill them up, then some of our care and quality issues may actually be repaired. And that's really what this is about. So I like to see it as a building capacity model, and punitive at the back end of that if people fail to reach their responsibilities, being given all the tools that they need.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Polly. Senator Green, did you have any follow-up questions?
This might have been covered off in more specifics, but just generally I wanted to understand what the views of all the witnesses are around the amount of detail that is going to be left to regulation making through this bill. It seems to me that there's quite a bit of information that will be left to be delegated legislation. We'll be asking whether that delegated legislation will be disallowable or what sort of process it'll go through. But that's the only question I had, just about any concerns about the amount of information we still don't have through this bill process.
Senator, I might respond to that first, and colleagues might afterwards. First, to acknowledge that this is, I think, a perennial issue, and not just about this legislation at all. And I say that having known that we've raised it before this committee in earlier compositions quite a few times. I mean, it is not a matter that is has a simple formula to it, because there is a virtue in some of the detail being the subject of subordinate legislation that is easier to amend, which always should be a disallowable instrument in our view. That's an important form of accountability, and we do from time to time see things disallowed. In this case, I think the government is very commendably moving at quite a pace to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission. Some of them are going to take quite a while to do, and therefore it's appropriate that this bill sets up the kind of framework, the skeleton onto which the detail is built. We've mentioned in our submission that there had been concern about consultative processes with consumers. Traditionally, consultative processes with the department around aged care matters have been dominated by providers and professionals. We have firstly seen a shift in that, so the department is clearly prioritising consultation with consumer advocates and consumers. But we had some concerns about how that was being managed. As we note in the submission, I'm very pleased to say that the department has responded very constructively to those concerns, and we now have a joint working group that's working on planning and coordinating the various consultations that the department is planning, many of them on matters in here, but also on other matters that don't require legislation. So that's a bit of a, it's not a definitive answer, Senator, but I think it's certainly something we need to keep an eye on. And I would just say that if CODA have had any concern about that, we would be talking to members of this committee certainly about those concerns if they were in the process.
Thanks, Mr. Yates. I think that was the second part of my question I probably should have asked in the first place is, do you have an expectation that there will be consultation around the delegated legislation?
We certainly do, and we've stated that pretty clearly in our submission, but we also, I mean, there has been quite a bit of consultation on some of these already. Some of these are, have been in the works for a while. And the longest, I think, probably the ANAC, but the restrictive practices has also been going on and developing for quite a while. And all of them, of course, have been the subject of the extensive discussion in the Royal Commission and invitation by the Royal Commission to make submissions, and that's informed what the government has then done. But yes, there is ongoing consultation. And as I said, there certainly has been a very apparent shift in the department under the government in this aged care space to say, hey, the first thing we need to do is make sure we're talking to people with lived experience of the system. So that's welcome. And what we're doing with the department now is working out structures and processes for doing that in a way that doesn't have everybody falling over themselves with different parts of the department trying to all have consultations at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Senator Rice next. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks everyone for appearing today and for your submissions. I also want to continue just asking some general questions about your thoughts about the code, as much as we know about it at the moment, noting that it, yes, will be determined in regulations. It's what we are told is that it's anticipated the code will be based on the existing NDIS code of conduct, that it will be finalised following a consultation process. And the aim of these amendments is to align with the obligations under the NDIS to increase harmonisation across the sectors. Can I get your response on whether you think the appropriateness of having this code based on the NDIS code, and whether there in fact are nuances and differences that would mean it should be different to what the NDIS code is?
I'm happy to start, Senator, if you'd like. So Craig here from OPAN. The harmonisation is really important because I think we are talking often about the same worker and the same workforce, and inadvertently can be competitive for that workforce, as we've sort of seen sometimes with around vaccination requirements of workforces moving between. So the alignment's really important. I think it is right to look at veterans and so the veterans, older veterans who receive care often from that same workforce as well, and to see that there's the same expectations, and that I think it's worth then looking to see, is the NDIS code of conduct, is there anything that can be added to that, particularly around respect and rights and those sorts of things. But a single code that sits across, I think, is appropriate given the transition of the workforce between those sectors. And it does go to also about workforce mobility and access to workforce, to make sure the workforce is adequate workforce and adequate access to that workforce as well.
Could I just add to that quickly that the consultative process around harmonisation has started and is about to speed up, and the code is a clear works in parallel with that. While the NDIS code is being used, if you like, as the initial template, Senator, the consultation is going to ask, what's worked and not worked in that code, why, and then asking both in a mixed sense but in separate senses of the aged care, disability and veteran sectors, what would and would not be appropriate. So there is not an assumption that you're just picking up a template and imposing it. It is a pretty open consultative process, and indeed you end up with so many questions being asked that how we structure that was a subject of quite a long discussion with them yesterday.
Thank you. Becca, did you have a view? I think you're on mute, but
sorry, I should have worked this out, shouldn't I? No, I support everything Craig and Ian just said.
Great, thank you. But I did want to go to you, Ms. Patetsis, particularly referring in your submission, as you referred to in your opening statement as well, as about the adherence of workers. I mean, your submission says the adherence of these workers to a code of conduct may be difficult or impossible where the operating environment created by the provider organisation and their governing persons is poor to begin with, and that punitive measures such as banning orders and civil penalty orders of $55,000 are exploitative where aged care workers may have little control over their working conditions. Would you like to expand on your concerns with this and any proposed changes that you think should be made to the legislation to overcome this?
Yeah, look, our main concern, as I said, is the transient nature of and insecure employment arrangements that a lot of care workers are under. Many of them don't know the shift that they're on before they are asked to come in. They don't know which location they're going to be placed at. They receive minimum, if any, training. They're often left to care. The conditions under which they can operate are not under their control entirely. And I think that providers need to ensure, as employers, that they provide the right environment for a workforce that is able to work at its best. So I would, and given the vulnerable nature of that workforce, because of their insecure situation, given the fact that many of them are on visas and temporary arrangements in terms of their migration status that increase their vulnerability, given that many of them are women who are actually juggling home, children and work, and that's the reason why they're also in that work. Given the insecurity of their employment when we have a supply positive situation when the provider can simply dismiss one to pick up another because there's so little training involved. I really think that the onus ought to be on the provider to build a workforce and be an employer of choice, and that any code of conduct imposed on a worker, on a care worker, ought to be on the back of making sure that employers do the right thing. So that's really the point we want to play. So a code of conduct that applies to workers really needs to take into account the employer's responsibility within which they are working. That doesn't say that workers do the wrong thing and that providers are not at fault sometimes, that it is about an individual. But I just caution that we need to make sure that very vulnerable bottom end of our workforce is well supported to do their jobs.
And so in terms of the amount of the penalty orders, I mean, the legislation that stands at the moment has the same level of fines for the providers as it does for the employees, I think. So do I hear you as saying that you think that's inappropriate and that the providers, that there should be more stringent penalties that would apply to the providers rather than to the workers?
Well, I mean, I think it's a case-by-case scenario, but I do think that providers need to be held foremost into account. So that I'm not trying to minimise the responsibility of a worker because they are key to providing quality care and can put and have put older people at risk by not behaving and doing their jobs properly. So I'm not taking away personal responsibility. I'm simply saying that we need to have evidence that when we impose a cost or a penalty on a worker, that it is not the consequence of poor management or employers. So, for instance, if I can give an example, if there is inappropriate behaviour towards an older person, perhaps verbal, if that worker has not been trained sufficiently, and it is simply a response that they are comfortable with because they have themselves, that's the way they communicate. If that is inappropriate and they receive a penalty for that, and they have not been trained otherwise, I hesitate to suggest that in fact the employer has erred in their responsibility. So I think that's the kind of nuancing I'm trying to pick up here, that we really need to train this workforce up. We can't expect that they're just going to hit the floor and do what we need. If they are, I mean, residential care is essentially a subacute or sort of subacute environment. This is very complex work that they do, and they have huge responsibility. We have to train our workforce, and we have to do it seriously, and we have to do it repetitively, and we have to treat it in a manner that enables them to do their job and protects older people from people who just do the wrong thing.
And so is it an issue then, I mean, that we would be implying these, a code and some pretty hefty penalties in the environment where we're not yet requiring that increased training? That's
my point.
Yeah.
I mean, we really need to put the training and the capability and ensure that everything is done to ensure quality care is possible. And when it fails, we need to find out why it fails. And if the failure is individual, because the individual has acted inappropriately, then we need to penalise. A whole bunch of stuff needs to happen at the front end of that, because we are not talking about a professional workforce.
Yeah.
We're talking about people who generally have very minimum training or inadequate training at the front end of their employment.
So we've got an issue with it because it's an interim legislation before we get the complete repackage, and yet we're having the penalties implied. I wonder whether COTA or OPAN would like to comment. Mr. Geer.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I mean, I think there's still value in setting the standard and the expectation. And what I think we're talking about here is the implementation timeframe for the penalties, and maybe that's more where that can be staged. And I think this is where it does come down to the operationalisation of this, about how the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission works to implement this, and ensuring that other steps have been taken in place. So while I agree with Ms. Patetsos around the need to be proportionate, there is a need to set the expectation and take this as an opportunity to set the expectation. It's in the proportionate response, and when these measures get used, I think that's important, and to take into consideration, again, due process, that if the worker was not appropriately supported and trained, I think that there is a mitigation there that has to be considered.
And I might just quickly add to that. I agree with what Craig just said, but I would have to say, with due respect to good providers, that the history of the aged care sector has been of stalling on all new initiatives and on lifting quality. Good providers do, but many others only do so when they're absolutely forced to. And I think it's really important, as Craig said, that we set the standard. And then, I mean, I know you have the Commissioner here with you this afternoon, but in my engagements with her, she is regularly talking about proportionality of response and grading, stepping in and new arrangements and so on. And so I'd agree with that, but it needs to be, unless deadlines are set and standards are set in this industry, we do not get improvement, and the people who suffer from that are the consumers.
Absolutely. Look, I've got two further areas of questioning, both which were raised in the OPAN submission, and one is obviously related to the code. We've then got the banning orders, and in the OPAN submission you say that it's unclear and not spelled out in the legislation how the banning register will be cross-referenced or linked to the aged care screening database, and how a ban will be notified to the NDIS and vice versa. Also unclear if the register will be public. And the legislation says it can be made public, not that it will. And that OPAN understands that there can be sensitivities around information such as banning being made public. However, this could be of benefit to organisations outside aged care or disability who support vulnerable persons such as veterans. Mr. Geer, would you like to expand on your concerns and how you think things should move forward then with regards to these banning orders and how they should be managed?
Well, thank you, Senator. I think this has always been the challenge, and when there was discussion about whether the screening process and the code of conduct and registration process should sit under AHPRA or sit quite separately. And again, we feel that this is the right bar in that it is a screening process and a register. What are the advantages, though, with the AHPRA register is that there is the ability to search the register and see if there's limitations placed on anyone, or if someone has lost their registration. So I think while it might be seen to be overburdensome to be under a national registration scheme, such as through AHPRA, there are some learnings there about the ability for people to search, for people to have a list, but also for other employers to be able to know whether that person should or shouldn't be employed. And that is the essence of what we're trying to achieve here, is for those people who shouldn't be continuing in these roles and functions because they are putting people at risk of abuse, that can be known. Now, when that occurs within the National Health Professionals Registration Scheme, there are a number of committees that review the disciplinary actions prior to those being made public. So some level of review process, a review committee, ideally a review committee that has representation of older people and consumers on there as well as other professions or legal services as well, could allow for the review before is put on the register or made public, and that way there is some protection to ensure due process as well, rather than an automatic flagging into the system. That would be one idea to tackle that appropriate review before public disclosure.
Right, thank you. Thank you. And look, my final question was also in your submission about the sort of funding model, the AN-ACC new model, where your submission expressed concern that the AN-ACC model deals only with care and supports and does not encompass access to and engagement with social and leisure activities. I was wondering if you'd like to expand on that concern as well.
I suppose it's to flag that that sort of traditional medical / clinical / nursing care is quite expensive, and if the funding that is made available is only delivered to that, we miss out often on also allied health interventions, but also social and emotional interventions as well. We've seen through COVID the impact on social and emotional wellbeing for older people, residential aged care, and so to have the ability to have a balance of supports that are needed for people to thrive and live an exceptional life while in residential aged care, I think is important as well, that it's not all just about the clinical subacute care, that is an aspect of it, but the social care and being able to fund and support those and those activities are just as important, and for some people probably where they want their focus to be. So to be able to have some balancing in that would be important.
Thank you.
Senator, if I might add, the CODA submission draws similar concerns and reserves our right to, as the AN-ACC process rolls out, to draw attention to that and to make representations as need be.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. So I think that's the end of our questions for these witnesses. So thank you to everybody for making yourselves available at short notice and also for your submissions. It's been very vital to our consideration. Unfortunately, there was no questions on notice, so that's even better. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you.
And from our timetable, we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, so I'm not sure that we have all of our witnesses at the moment, so we might just quickly suspend until 11:30 and just if our senators could stay online until then and our forthcoming witnesses are tracked down and join us. So thank you very much, everyone. And I will welcome representatives from the Australian College of Nursing, the Health Services Union and the United Workers Union, and thank everyone for appearing before us today. I'm Wendy Askew, the chair of the committee, and I have with me Senators Rice, Green, Polly and McLaughlin. And before we begin, I would just like to ask each of you to provide your name and the capacity in which you're appearing for the benefit of the Hansard transcript. Can we start with the Australian College of Nursing?
Hello, I'm Adjunct Professor Kylie Ward, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian College of Nursing.
Thank you, Professor Ward. And the Health Services Union?
Hi, Lauren Hutchins. I'm the Secretary of the Aged Care and Disability Division at New South Wales, ACT and Queensland.
Thank you very much. And the United Workers Union? Ms. Smith joined us. I can see Ms. Smith that has joined us, but I can't hear anything.
I'm here, but I'm just managing my video.
Fair enough. Do you just want to give us your name and the capacity for the minute, and we'll at least have your voice on record?
Carolyn Smith, Director, Aged Care, United Workers Union.
Okay, good luck with sorting out your video. So I'm going to invite each of you to make a brief opening statement should you wish to, and after that we'll go to the committee members to ask some questions, but we will start with Professor Ward if she'd like to start.
Thank you. I would like to acknowledge the lands on which we meet today. I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. The Australian College of Nursing would like to thank the Standing Committee on Community Affairs for the opportunity to provide further feedback on the Aged Care and Other Legislation Amendment, Royal Commission Response Number 2, Bill of 2021. As the peak professional body for the nursing profession, the Australian College of Nursing is committed to ensuring every older person in Australia has access to safe, high-quality care that respects their right to dignity, respect and autonomy. We represent thousands of nurses who have dedicated their professional lives to caring for older people in residential aged care, the community and in hospital settings. These nurses have often worked in an industry that can be isolating, is not paid equally to their colleagues, and has experienced much criticism in under-resourced circumstances. Yet they have remained dedicated to their residents, clients and patients and their families and loved ones. The Australian College of Nursing welcomed the Royal Commission's recommendations in their final report, but we do not believe this bill goes far enough to give nurses the confidence that the abuse, neglect and mismanagement rampant we saw throughout the Royal Commission will be fixed. Unless the purpose of the new Aged Care Act is to ensure older persons in Australia receive the high quality, safe and person-centred care they deserve, our members believe any other reforms to the aged care legislation will be pointless. And some of the areas of concern we have, I would like to outline now. Firstly, there needs to be explicit registered and/or enrolled nursing staff available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to provide care, and this not be tied to administrative duties. Also, the Australian College of Nursing cannot support registration over regulation of unregulated healthcare workers. National registration, a new code of conduct and expanded commission of powers cannot guarantee that an older person or the public will be protected from unsuitable workers, however they are defined. Without a national record that the public have access to view, there is nothing to stop abusive or neglectful workers from moving to a different jurisdiction or employer to get a new job. Unregulated healthcare workers must be regulated and also be provided with access to a minimum of 20 hours paid continuing professional development per year. As the Australian College of Nursing understands it, the Australian National Aged Care Classification will discriminate against people living with dementia who are ambulatory and wandering, as well as those requiring adequate end-of-life care, as their care needs and costs are considered too high for this modelling. Alternatively, care may be compromised if sufficient funding and consideration is not provided for high acuity or clinical deterioration. Regarding the expansion of the serious incident reporting scheme to in-home care, our members would like to know what are the consequences for a care worker who misses something compared to someone who fails to report, and what are the roles and responsibilities of subcontractors under this scheme. The Australian College of Nursing cannot support the use of arbitrary numbers in new requirements for governing bodies of aged care organisations, like the number of 40 beds presented. This will further marginalise those with complex needs and those living in rural and remote areas. Every single resident deserves sound clinical governance, no matter where they live or the size of the facility they are residing in. Care management and package management must be funded separately. Providers face increasingly high administration, accreditation and auditing costs at the expense of providing safe and appropriate person-centred care based on the older person's care needs and complexity, and we very much stress this point. And finally, we support the use of a substitute decision maker to give consent to restrictive practices, but we have the following concerns. Is the consent informed and valid? Who can initiate an SDM order? And when will it be reviewed? We thank you for hearing our concerns and considering the important role the nursing profession has in caring for older Australians.
Thank you. So we'll now go to the Health Services Union. So Ms. Hutchins.
Thank you, Senator. And I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting with you today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Health Services Union has made a submission to the inquiry and I won't go into specific detail around the recommendations we've made there, just to make a couple of points. Right now there are tens of thousands of aged care workers who are working in residential aged care facilities or providing care in an older person's home. They are tired and they are fatigued after 20 months on the front line of this pandemic. They are also tired and fatigued of waiting for a response to the Aged Care Royal Commission and the extensive recommendations that were made out of that. I'll bring out one recommendation that I think is problematic in relation to this bill. The recommendation 77 around what we would see is a positive registration of personal care workforce to provide support, to provide training, to provide recognition of qualifications. This legislation is legislation light. It is light in substance and in detail, and that is problematic for a workforce, as I said, who are tired and fatigued. We have an opportunity to rethink and revalue the aged care workforce, but we must do it right. The holes in the legislation, we will wait till later to give you the detail, is hugely problematic. The Health Services Union supports a code of conduct and the workforce supports a code of conduct, but we want the detail, and we believe that workers have a right to be part of the makeup in that code itself. We also think that there has to be a really deep understanding that sometimes the failures in aged care, sometimes is probably very generous, but are deeply cemented in the lack of resources, the lack of staff, the lack of support in aged care facilities, the code of conduct in trying to single out workforce and failing to recognise the obligations of organisations and fundamentally the government is hugely problematic to us. We want a code of conduct that delivers a robust, and change to aged care. It delivers for older Australians, it delivers for workforce, but we want the detail and we want it to be done correctly, and we have concerns around that. I would point out as well that some of the pieces of this legislation don't seem to capture those non-approved providers. So those who seek to set themselves up to make a quick buck out of older Australians don't fall within scope, and that is hugely problematic. So for us, we would say that time needs to be put into making this the best it can be, that there needs to be an investment in engaging the sector broadly. Otherwise, all we are doing is ticking a box to say that we've done something, not all of it, in relation to the Aged Care Royal Commission's recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms Smith from United Workers Union.
Yeah, look, and again, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Wajak Noongar Budja and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. United Workers Union represents care and support staff in West Australia, Queensland, South Australia, Northern Territory and home care workers around Australia. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I want to. I want to speak to a couple of the issues in the legislation. One is the use of ANAC, and the other is the worker screening process. But first, I think I want to raise a sort of similar concerns that I've heard from other speakers, which is these changes that we see here. One, lack a lot of detail, but two, are not really central to improving quality in aged care, which I think we are all very committed to, and our members are incredibly committed to. What's missing here when we're talking about here is any issue around workforce issues. That workforce is key to improving quality care in aged care, and specifically enough time to care. And so care hours, and also attraction, retention and training of good staff. So doing a screening, you're talking about screening without thinking about all those other issues, without thinking about wages, without thinking about how burnt out and exhausted the current workforce are, I think is problematic. I find it very problematic that that's the first piece of legislation we're dealing with around quality of care. Look, in terms of the use of ANAC, I guess we just want to make some general comments where, there's a lot obviously that's going to happen in the regulation of this legislation, but we're worried that the pricing is not clear, what the level of the national weighted average unit is going to be, and the kind of attachment of care time to resident classes. I do want to spend a bit more time talking about the worker screening process. And again, what I would say is, at the time of the Royal Commission, there was a real crisis, of quality of care in aged care. That crisis has got worse. And the staffing crisis in aged care is at an all-time high. Literally any facility you walk into around Australia will have shifts unfilled here, and that relates obviously to worldwide issues around migration and staffing, but it also relates to wages and the understaffing. So I would say these issues are key to quality. In terms of the actual worker screening process, and again, very light on detail, but nothing about cost. Aged care workers are some of the lowest paid workers in Australia. What we see from the recent workforce census is that casualisation has grown significantly in the workforce. I think 4 times higher. I think we see that. So the cost of the registration, the screening process should not be a barrier. I think the lack of information about what processes workers are going to have to challenge any decision or any order is really worrying. And then I want to really talk about the composition of the workforce, because this is an increasingly culturally and linguistically diverse workforce. Again, the workforce census said 35%. I would say it's probably, that has changed even since the workforce census is done, and it's significantly higher in the care workforce. And we have to allow for that in anything we build. And one of the issues we have to allow for is the daily experience of racism that our members working in aged care experience, and how that impacts complaints that may be made about them, and how that impacts the propensity of residents to make complaints, and that particularly increases when we end up in the sort of dementia area, and also their ability then to access and challenge any decisions that are made. Again, I would echo the comments about the non-approved providers and subcontractors in terms of how this legislation relates to them. That is a growing area. We had the federal government promoting Mabel as the answer to the problems in aged care. My understanding is none of those workers working through that system would be covered under this legislation. So if this is a key way to deal with workforce quality, and Mabel is one of the answers that's been promoted, I don't understand why that hasn't been included. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will go to start with Senator Green for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you everyone for your submissions. They've been very helpful in informing the process today. I've just got a couple of questions for each witness. If I can start with the Australian College of Nursing. Your submission does raise some concerns regarding the exemption of small providers, and I think that everyone sort of touched on that today. And the amendments relating to governance of approved providers. Can you just explain, I guess, the issue, but also how you would propose addressing some of those concerns, while also taking into account, I guess, the capacity of smaller providers?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And it's a discussion that we had with aged care nursing leaders from around the country. We feel that if provisions are made, it further disadvantages the smaller providers. So who would be a smaller provider? It is going to be in regional, rural or remote areas, or it's going to be for highly specialised and concentrated members of the population that are at higher acuity. So, psychogeriatric or something very specific. So we feel that the clinical governance that has been heavily required over many years as we went from a clinical model to a social model absolutely needs to be reinvested. We think that this will further support not only the governance of every resident everywhere, depending on the size of the facility, but also there's a great opportunity for us to invest in a workforce that's predominantly female dominated. So we would see that it's actually the responsibility of employers or jurisdictions or communities to actually invest in skilling and attracting clinicians and to having that representation on board for good board diversity and good governance and organisational governance, rather than saying that it might be difficult at a numerical level. We feel that that wouldn't happen in any other industry, in banking or anywhere else. So why should compromises be made that would disadvantage already marginalised or vulnerable cohorts of the population? And so whilst it might not be an easy fix, so to speak, or that would just require time and effort and attracting people to be skilled to be able to fulfil their duties. You could get retired clinicians. There's certainly a broad range of people, and I think that it would also fill a gender gap that we have in these governing roles.
Great, thank you. And just for the United Workers Union, thank you. And I guess your opening statement does raise a number of issues. In terms of the pre-employment screening and the code of conduct, you've raised concerns about that, but more broadly, it's clear that some of the details will be left to delegated legislation. What's your expectation around consultation on that from the department and the government? And have you got concerns about this bill passing while there's quite a lot of detail still to be decided?
Yeah, look, that's right. Passing legislation that you don't really know what the outcome of is a real concern. And I think it's a real concern, as I said, in a workforce where we are struggling I don't think we are managing to fill shifts and have enough people working in the industry right now. There's been a lot of talk about the post-COVID, the great resignation, people are calling it. I think the intentions of aged care workers concern me in terms of leaving the industry. So I think making sure that this legislation, by the way, I should make it clear that we support and our members absolutely support this. They want a way to get rid of workers who shouldn't be in the industry. They absolutely support that. What they don't want is this to be yet another barrier to them continuing working in the industry that they love.
Great. And something I've just picked up on in your opening statement, you raised the issue more broadly around casualisation. I guess my first question is, has that increased during this COVID pandemic period in the industry? And this is a bill, primarily designed to support quality and safety. But how does the increase in casualisation impact quality and safety and your members or the workers that are working? I would imagine it would be quite difficult to maintain the same level of care with increasing casualisation.
Yeah, I think the first thing that happens is it drives people out of the industry. If you are paid low wages, you don't have guaranteed hours, and you are working at the limit of your capacity, your physical and emotional capacity, eventually something's got to give. So I think that's the first impact on quality and safety. But the second, you're right, is just the kind of impact of new staff coming in, agency staff or casual staff filling shifts. And workers tell me, you're doing a job and a half because you're having to explain not only where everything is, but so much of the work involves kind of emotional labour. And so much of it is about the relationship you have with the residents that you care for. So that, Mrs. X, you will respond to a joke. Mr. Y, you've got to be quiet and calm. all that sort of, inbuilt institutional knowledge gets lost when the workforce gets casualised. And particularly when you're dealing with, people where, dementia might be an issue, that really impacts your ability to provide quality care.
And just finally, and I've got some more questions for other witnesses, but you did raise some concerns about the code of conduct and the pre-employment screening. Happy for you to take this on notice if you want to come back to the committee, but have you got any ideas about how we could recommend improving those processes or fixing some of those concerns?
Yeah, look, I mean, perhaps we could come back. We certainly, we certainly made submissions to the Royal Commission about these issues. We haven't made submissions to this, but as I said, I think the key is just being the same isn't equal when people are having different experiences in the workforce. And certainly our members from COLD backgrounds have a very different experience in the workforce. Very few of them would not have had explicit but certainly underlying racism not from all the residents and not even from the majority of them, but certainly as an underlying issue. And when you talk to them about a screening process, that is one of the first things they raise is, I've had workers of African heritage talking about residents calling them slaves. This is their experience on a regular basis. And they are very, very worried that they will, they already experience a higher level of complaints at a kind of screening process. And, they are very, very concerned about that issue.
Yeah, thank you so much. For the Health Services Union, I wanted to touch on a similar issue you've raised in relation to pre-screening. You talk about non-approved providers being exempt and the risks that poses to older people, and also the issue around a default worker exclusion. I just wanted to see if you could explain that a little bit further. And again, if you've got any suggestions about how we can rectify those concerns.
So in relation to the non-approved provider not being captured by pieces of legislation, that is incredibly concerning for us in relation to, that it's our position that essentially anyone who provides service in aged care needs to be held to the same standard. And particularly if in receipt of government funding that there needs to be a clearly understood set of rules and guidelines that apply to all. To Ms Smith's example of Mabel, we have heard in other inquiries, Mabel describes its relationship with workers as clients. They don't see those workers who provide services as actually anything other than transactional, not that they have any responsibility for the care that's provided, for the work that they provide. That is hugely, hugely worrying when we've come out of an Aged Care Royal Commission that has talked, it fundamentally has put workforce at the front in terms of where change needs to take place. So for us, that the idea that you could operate and provide services and essentially say that all of the screening, all of the checks and balances, the code of conduct doesn't apply to these workers simply because they do their work through a website is a huge failure of the legislation, in particular in relation to that. Now, you had a second part to the question there that I have now completely forgotten because I was on the spot. So
that's okay. It was about the default of worker exclusion. That was one of the other concerns about pre-screening. I guess it's sort of about how that will affect workers more broadly that you represent.
So the excluded without the opportunity to actually plead a case and then to...
Yeah, that doesn't seem to be outlined yet already in this bill. It might come in delegated legislation, but some sort of procedural fairness mechanism that you would expect at any type of, industrial level.
And I think that's consistent not just in the pre-screening, but also then in our concerns around the ability to ban workers from the sector, is that without the detail, you have huge concerns that that procedural fairness isn't followed, and what we would expect in a normal, as you say, industrial setting, those rules don't apply here. Particularly, and I made the point earlier that when if there is a breach of code of conduct, and what we don't know is what the code of conduct looks like here, and nor do we know how it will be dealt with. But if those breaches actually come about from issues that are organisational or structural, so to assist. You have a resident in a residential aged care facility who's a to assist. There are no staff on the floor. You have someone who is in pain. There are so many things that happen in an aged care facility that are driven by understaffing. What do you do when you're dealing with a human being that is crying out for help? Do you say, I'm sorry, I've got a code of conduct here that says I can't do A, B, C, D, but if the code of conduct also says that I need to make sure that you're okay, the conflicting, there are so many unknowns in relation to this, and how a worker then gets to represent themselves and say, well, it's actually not me, it is an understaffing issue, and it's absolutely the organisation's problem here. So we just have concerns that the lack of detail, the stepping out of procedural fairness, how that will play out for workers who are already vulnerable, who are already, highly stressed workforce, is problematic and not addressed in the legislation.
Yeah, thanks. And there's a civil penalty regime that you've referred to in your submission as well. Can we just briefly understand your concerns there? And then I think I might have to hand over to other senators. I've got one more question after that.
That it's disproportionate, that the amount that is required, or that's within the legislation, and I've got it here, is 250 civil penalty units, is more than an average aged care worker earns in a year, and is the same that is applied to an organisation that is applied to a worker. Like they're pretty serious penalties that are applied in this instance. We're not suggesting we haven't put an alternative to the committee. However, we are saying that needs to be reviewed and it needs to be fair.
Okay. And just finally, I think this is actually a good question for all of the witnesses, if you have a view. I understand, and much more intimately the recommendations of the Royal Commission and all of the evidence that was received. But I understand that the government isn't at this stage following the Royal Commission's recommendation for a national registration scheme of workers. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think the government is doing enough on workforce in terms of their broader reforms? And what are your sort of concerns in relation to that?
Would you like us all to?
Anyone can jump in, because I'm sure everyone has a view.
We submitted evidence into the Royal Commission, and the Australian College of Nursing has a white paper on the regulation of the unregulated healthcare worker, and we can provide that to you if required. But this is where we find that not enough is being done, because there's implications for residents and their families, but also for workers. So whilst there are definitely workers that we've learnt we don't want in the system, there's actually a larger number of unregulated workers, and even nursing regulated workers, who are giving far more than is required, that are exceptional, go above and beyond, and can easily be disadvantaged. And one of the areas that we would see that is the investment in some mandatory educational requirements for their professional development and professional practice standards, and that's quite employer dependent, or the onus can be shifted on the employee to invest. And with the national, that's why we're pushing for regulation. So myself as a nurse, I have to do a minimum to meet the standards. The public can see notifications. We feel that that's the only peace of mind that we would get to protect everybody, and then actually make the shift that all of these workers deserve the investment and lift in terms of the regard, because of the type of care that is delivered. And the intimate relationships that they have with the people that they care for and their families. Senator Green, can I just make a comment from a different perspective about your question around the casualisation of the workforce?
Of course.
And I'm going to come from I can speak from a nursing perspective. I think the real challenge that we all face is that this industry has been battered and beaten, and really good people are remaining or leaving who have done a tremendous amount in difficult conditions. And I completely agree with my colleague Carolyn in the comments of what does that mean. But in some instances, what we've found is that the only way to survive working in this industry is to become a casual worker. And the reason being is that the casualisation might be unfamiliar or familiar workers, but there's certainly nursing agencies, especially through COVID. COVID's absolutely highlighted the issues that were already there and exacerbated the problems. But the nursing agencies have actually provided the supplement workforce that has kept the nation going in, particularly in aged care in a lot of places over the past year or so. But when we've talked to our members, in some instances, they cannot get the shifts that they want. They cannot get the employers supporting them around their family or care needs. And the only way that they can actually get some support around their ability to provide care and then meet their own personal requirements is to leave the security of permanent full-time or part-time employment and to go casual or agency so that they then have a choice in their shifts. And so they may actually attend a regular facility or facilities, but it's just then and in other instances, we've heard nurses say there's so much burden when you're a full-time, the only registered nurse on a shift or a facility to do all then the paperwork and the administrative sides of policy review that it's completely onerous and pulling those nurses away from actually having the time to care. And it's leaving them really dissatisfied and despondent. And the one salvation in some instances, not every, is to then leave the security of permanent work or a permanent place and be casual or agency so that they can then navigate turning up and really mainly doing care and not getting administrative. So I think that there's a couple of sides to that, and it's not in always the best interests of the residents, and it's definitely we could do more for the workers.
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Warden. I think what that sort of shows is that there's no good choices at the moment. Those are two not satisfactory outcomes for workers or for residents, as you put it there. Chair, I'm conscious of time, so I'm happy to leave it there unless the HSU wanted to contribute to that last question.
I just wanted to say that we support a positive registration scheme that actually invests in workers in their professional development, in ongoing training, that it's understood that this is an ongoing requirement of the job and acknowledged by the government as such, that and this, that's where the Royal Commission made its recommendations, and that's where we wanted to see the legislation. And that's where I'm saying, that the bits and pieces aligning with recommendations instead of fully implementing are concerning for us. We do, our members want to see that. They certainly want their skills recognised, and they want the opportunity to develop and to participate in training. So that's certainly the response we would make.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now go to Senator Polly if she's got some questions.
Yes, thank you. That was all really good information, and really appreciate the time you've taken to appear before us. I may have missed this, but I just wanted to ask from the Nursing College point of view were you consulted by the federal government in terms of this legislation, and has there been any discussions in relation to the regulations that they intend to put in place?
We've had an opportunity, thank you, Senator Polly, we've had an opportunity to put submissions in, more so than consultation, I would have to say. And we published our white paper around regulation in 2017, and we've had more response and uptake from submitting it through the Royal Commission than what we've been able to receive in getting the impact or the policy change that we would like to have seen from a government perspective. But we have continued to champion this through the Commission and at every opportunity that we have been able to, just to really to get us to a place where we can all feel comfortable and confident about who receives care and who delivers care and the system that's, that's enabling it.
Yes, thank you. I would suggest that this is the first time, certainly in my time in the Senate, where we've had media attention on aged care. We've had the Royal Commission. The public are very concerned. It is on their radar. This legislation, how is that going to assist attracting more nurses, even if we went down the 24/7, having a nurse in every aged care home around the country? How is this legislation going to help recruit and retain those nurses?
Yeah, look, it's a really good point. Now, we've had a lot of involvement, and even before the Royal Commission, we worked very closely with Professor John Pelaez and the task force and the 14 recommendations. So we've been heavily involved in advocating for better standards of nursing care in aged care facilities. I think in the short term, I can't make you any promises, to be honest, and I wouldn't. I think that what we need to see is legislative and sustainable change that can then attract articulated pathways. We're working with the government now in transition to practice of new graduates into aged care. There are some excellent providers who are absolutely investing in the nursing workforce and skilling nurses up and making sure that there's that nursing governance. But it's had reputational damage. I can't, say any different. And so what we need is to see legislation that enables nurses and us as a professional organisation to see that there is a commitment to quality and safety and standards of care. And even if then, we have to reach those, I think that's the biggest concern. And that's why I said the legislation itself is pointless if we're not focusing on proper funded care and through the experience. So, those with cognitive impairment or dementia or deterioration, or even at end-of-life cares, the amount of resources that are required if you're the only registered nurse on, which I have been, if somebody deteriorates, you don't have the capacity to then care for other residents. So I think we need almost the legislation to be good faith and then to be able to attract and build generational change and make this an attractive pathway for career employment rather than people feeling like they are sacrificing their reputation or their professional licence. It's quite lonely, as I mentioned, if you're the only registered nurse on, and every relative that comes in wants to talk to you about their care, and the doctors and the allied health professionals, and you're working with the team. So I think we need to build up so that it's a more supportive environment.
My next question I'll put to the unions, and that is I think there's about 22 reports into aged care over the last probably 15 years, and all the parliamentary reports, I've been involved in those committees. So when the Royal Commission was called, I think it'd be fair to say both the government, the opposition and the Greens, we all knew that there were major issues in this sector. I don't see anything in this legislation which will attract and retain our workforce in this sector. What we have now, and it's been expressed far more eloquently than I can in relation to how tired our workforce really is, particularly over the last 20 months. There used to be a supplement for workers to develop more staff and training. We've spoken and heard this morning about being job ready and training, and you have to be registered. What incentive is there to go on and get more qualifications, do a dementia certificate? If you speak a second or a third language, where is there any incentive for carers in this sector to actually invest themselves more when they are actually the working poor in this country now?
Look, I would just agree with what you're saying. I think if this is the answer to quality care and aged care, we're asking the wrong question. And my concern about this legislation, and again, I would say we support a screening process, but we would support a positive one that comes with, entitlement to training and support. But this is not what's going to fix the quality crisis in aged care in Australia. And that ability to attract and retain staff, I think, has got worse since the Royal Commission. And I think, we're heading into a really dangerous period for aged care.
I'll just add, we have a member who's a diversional therapist. She has 2 bachelor degrees. She is heavily invested in her job. She loves her job. Her son, who is a casual lawnmower at a golf course, earns more than she does. And she laughs about that because, at the end of the day, she's dedicated to her vocation. She loves her job. But if we don't get the wages right in aged care, we can't attract people. And the wages have a flow-on effect to staffing as well. So in some of the experiences for understaffing or staffing issues aren't about casuals per se. We have incredibly low-hour contracts for permanent staff in aged care, particularly in the personal care space. So you will have a contract that says that you can work 8 hours a fortnight, and that's all that your employer has to guarantee you. You will work 40 hours a week because the roster will allow you to do that. And so, you do earn this, but at any point, your employer has the right to cut back your hours back to that 8 hour a fortnight. And you live with that insecurity of knowing that you only have that guarantee. During the pandemic, this year in New South Wales, so this second major lockdown for us, we discovered we had a personal carer who was working 3 jobs and she was working 155 hours a fortnight. 155 hours a fortnight. She was quite literally finishing one job to change her uniform to start another job. And why? Because her wages are so low that she could not support herself and her family to work what others would see as a pretty reasonable working week. If we don't fix wages, we will burn out the workers that we have because they are covering the shifts that they need to cover right now. If we don't fix wages, we're not going to attract the casual lawnmower. He's never going to come and work for us because he could earn more with no responsibility at all. And there is nothing in this legislation that at all addresses that. As the funding body, the federal government could right now change the wages and conditions of workers in the sector. They could do it today, and they don't.
I think when we're talking about recruitment and retaining and attracting staff, particularly as carers, I can't find anywhere in the legislation that entrenches the need for quality education that is acceptable and is recognised across the country. I just want to know whether, you agree that there is a lack of national level of training, because so many providers have given evidence over many years, and when I've visited homes, that people aren't coming job ready. So I'd like your opinions on that. And I should have asked you from the outset, have you, either of the unions, been involved in any consultation with the government?
That's a quick answer. So that's a no on this legislation and other issues. Look, I think, aged care workers tell me they really want education, but it's a bit of a push-pull thing because they say, we want to be educated, but actually if we're going to put this effort in, are we going to be rewarded? And the answer is no. So I think, everything is connected to everything in this kind of attraction and retention world. People do want to learn more and understand more, but they get understandably resentful when they do that, that they're not being recognised. Certainly, the experience of the education that's given by providers is more and more, it's online. It's what, workers just call it tick and flick. I've done my tick and flick this month. So, and they're very, very cynical about the ability to learn, what is a human service through online or very basic kind of training. So, but as I said, you kind of can't have one without the other. And even, you know, you can't have education if people aren't being rewarded for that education. But even wages won't fix the absolute sort of emotional and physical exhaustion that people feel. I mean, I was in a workplace the other day, and one of our long-time members, who is a union delegate, said, I've handed in my resignation. And I said, why? And she said, well, someone died last week and I was on shift when she died. And I kept saying, I'll come back to you, I'll come back to you. And I never got back to her because we were understaffed. And she said, I cannot live with that emotional pressure anymore. I cannot live going home knowing that I left an older person to die by themselves. I'm out of the industry. And that is a story we hear over and over again. So it's the whole deal.
I just want to confirm that the Health Services Union hasn't been consulted either, and to reiterate all of Ms. Smith's comments in relation to training being a tick and flick approach, that our members don't feel that they have, their skills have expanded as such. It is just about compliance. It is just about saying that we've undertaken that for the, our employer has directed us to do so. It isn't a robust system that says, we're going to have a new resident that has particular needs come in, let's sit down, let's have a discussion about what else do we need to learn, how can we put that in our practice, or here is the latest in relation to dementia care. They're not the conversations that take place in aged care. They don't exist for the most part.
Senator, can I just add, we have been consulted and I sit on an industry reference group for aged care at a Certificate 3 level, and we've been absolutely championing that subjects like dementia, palliative care, and so we've really made sure that at that Certificate 3 level that there is more ability to understand the role within aged care. So we have been working on that for probably a couple of years to get that standardised. I think the real challenge is, though, that not every employer, we've heard through the Royal Commission, some people get employed without that. And so even if you had national standards or the quality of the education, it's then you just have to hope that people will employ people with those qualifications. I think the other deterrent that I'm sure my colleagues are concerned about is then penalties in terms of, I think a deterrent is if the same penalties that an organisation gets, an individual get, is absolutely concerning through this legislation, and I think that would have to be looked at, but I'm sure my colleagues are all over that. Because you can't expect those same type of finances or people to incur those penalties as the same as an organisation would get. And the other thing that I think would go a long way to attracting or for recruitment or retention in the long term, and as I mentioned, we have to separate out administrative fees from care fees. Otherwise, there's going to be no money to get licensed professionals, whether it be a nurse or an allied health professional or anyone. And then your care workers, they're put in unreasonable positions. So I think we need to see some evidence in this legislation that there's some commitment to appropriate funding to then pipeline the succession planning of the workforce.
Well, thank you very much for that evidence. If there are any amendments that you would like to see, if this legislation will come before us, I would think fairly quickly. If there are any amendments, just would ask you to put those forward. And again, thank you for your evidence today, and for those who put in a submission, we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Senator Rice, who's got a couple of questions to finish us off. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your evidence today and for your submissions. It's been really, really powerful and important evidence for the committee to hear. I particularly want to thank Ms. Smith for your story of that worker leaving the sector and the reasons behind that. It just sort of lays it out so tragically as where the problems are. I mean, your evidence today is really, underlined the need for, adequate wages, condition, training as being core to the provision of aged care, of quality aged care. Obviously, this legislation doesn't go to those, and the government has been quite upfront that it's, this is all that's going to be part of the overall package. The question to me then is, in terms of this legislation, should we just be accepting this? I mean, it's been put to us as being legislation that's important to get in place, quickly, rather than waiting for the complete overhaul of the aged care framework. In the previous session, we had COTA and OPAN who basically said, yeah, there are problems with it, but we should pass this legislation, and then there'll be issues with implementation and issues of working out the code of conduct, but we should pass this legislation now. In your submissions, you've suggested areas that need to be amended. I mean, what's your overall view of the need for this legislation now? I mean, obviously, if we got the amendments up to address the issues that you're concerned about, I think everyone would agree that this legislation should be passed now. But as it stands at the moment, where do you stand on whether there in fact is a need to pass this legislation now?
We'll go along the top again. I don't agree with the comments that were made by the previous people that you referred to, because I think that the challenge with rushing it or not having the detail for the members that we all represent is it's always, the devil in the details. So, of course, change is required. We all know that. The trouble with rushing it is the consequences once it's legislated to actually change the law. And we will continue then fighting for how long for the rights of the workers and the residents. It'll be the same vulnerable cohorts that we've been championing for years that deserve a voice and deserve this to be their chance for change, that we'll end up be trying to change laws. So my thought would be that rather than rushing it is take the feedback from organisations like ours and others that have, we've turned everything around really quickly. We're the voice of the people, whether that's, the nursing or the residents or all of the workers. These are the people that have the answers and the solutions. So we're in principle supporting, but it's these little changes that will make a tremendous difference and give people confidence. So I would say, no, don't rush and fix it later, because how many years have we done that for? Let's make the changes now, get it right, and show the people that we represent and the Australian population and the Australian community that we value older people and that we're prepared to take the time and make the investment so that they receive the care and the living arrangements that they deserve.
Thanks, Professor Ward.
Senator, look, I mean, I obviously started my my verbal submission saying I thought that there were other things more important and key to quality care, but I certainly don't oppose the concept of legislation on these issues. I have concerns about what is in or not in, more importantly, what is not in this legislation. So I wouldn't be saying this has to be stopped. I'm just saying this has to be, I'm disappointed this is the first thing the government's chosen to do, but are they important issues? Yes. Should this legislation as it is be passed? No. Some significant changes, or we are going to have a lot of unintended consequences, I think.
Thanks, Ms. Smith.
And certainly the view of the Health Services Union is that we need to get this right, that we have gone through an aged care royal commission that has been just horrific to listen to for workers who lived through that, for families, for older Australians, to now just say we're going to just, we'll get there in the end, does a huge disservice to those people who sat through all of those hearings and read every report. We need to get it right. And if we're delaying delaying bits and pieces of the legislation to get it right is the way to do it, then we should do that. And we have made submissions that quite clearly there are specific areas within the legislation that we say pull out, get it right before you put it in legislation.
Mm. So do you feel, what would there be anything lost by not passing it now? I mean, is there any reason, are there any bits of it you think, yeah, absolutely, given the current circumstances, should be passed now? Or is it basically we're much better to, if it's not amended, to put it off and get it right as a package?
I'm a bit of a cynic, I have to say, and I will, I'll put it out there that I have concerns that the legislation has been put up so that at potentially a federal election is called shortly, that at least there has been some response to the Aged Care Royal Commission in legislation. And so for me, there is too much invested in getting this right to rush it through. So for us, I don't see that there are particular parts that shouldn't have a deeper dive, that shouldn't be investigated, and have all of the sector come together and say, yes, this is going to work, and this is what was actually intended by the Aged Care Royal Commission.
Thank you. Look, thanks all of you. Thanks, Ms. Hutchins. Thanks, Ms. Smith, Professor Ward. Really appreciated your evidence today. It's been very useful to the committee. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. And so that brings us to the end of our time today. So thank you very much, everyone, for making yourselves available and for those submissions that you have provided. If there is anything else, as we've mentioned during the course of the morning, if there's anything else that you would like to provide, we have a very short turnaround on questions on notice. So if you could provide it within the next 24 hours or by the close of business tomorrow, it would be appreciated. But on that note, thank you very much. And the committee will now suspend for a lunch break and resume at 2 p.m. Thank you very much. So I now welcome representatives from Allied Aged Care, the Australian Aged Care Collaboration and Palliative Care Australia. So thank you all for appearing before our committee today. I'm Wendy Askew, Chair of the committee, and I have our Deputy Chair, Senator Janet Rice, and Senators Green, Polly and McLaughlin joining us as well. So before we begin, can I ask you please to state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript, and I'll just work through in the order. So Allied Aged Care first.
Hi, it's Alwyn Blaze, CEO and Principal Physiotherapist of AAC Allied Aged Care.
Perfect, thank you. And the Australian Aged Care Collaboration?
So Sean Rooney, Chief Executive Officer, Leading Age Services Australia.
Paul Sadler, CEO of Aged and Community Services Australia.
Thank you. We can't hear you. Sorry, could you repeat that? We couldn't hear you.
Tim Derek Dittrich, Acting Executive Director for Government and Public Affairs.
Thank you very much.
AACC, AXA.
Thank you. And Palliative Care?
Camilla Rowland, CEO, Palliative Care Australia.
And Katie Snell, National Policy Manager, Aged Care and Diverse Needs Groups, Palliative Care Australia.
If you have somebody in the room. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Senator.
Sorry?
Excuse me, Senator. I didn't have a chance to introduce myself, just for the record. Tim Hicks, General Manager, Policy Advocacy and Advisory for Leading Age Services Australia.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tim. Okay, so I'll invite each of you your organisations to make a opening statement if you so wish. So we might start in the same order with Allied Aged Care, if that's okay.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator and Committee, for having us here today. I just wanted to say I haven't done a prepared statement. I'm just here in my capacity for many, many years, 22 years of being a physio, being very fortunate enough to look after some old Australians, as I know some very gifted, talented people do every single day. And I'm here in my capacity from what I've seen in my company in over 22 years. I've just lost some people there, I think. But I was just going to say, I used to joke I'd be doing this until I was in the chair needing the massage. So I really believe in aged care. I think some great nursing homes and care out there. But why I'm here is because I'm seriously concerned about the government's decision not to separately fund physiotherapy and allied health in aged care. I do believe, and many in my industry do, that this will be the death of physiotherapy and allied health, which is absolutely vital and life and death for older people. So I really have been calling for some time that that decision be looked at to include separate mandated physio and allied health, because that is what the Royal Commission called for, more allied health than the 8 minutes per day that we're getting at the moment. And that was replaced with the equivalent of 2 seconds per day that was funded. So it's nowhere near enough. That's been confirmed by many, many people a lot more educated and in the research space than myself. So that's why I'm here, and I'm super grateful for the opportunity to represent a lot of older people who need physio, who don't have that ability to call for that themselves. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will go on to Australian Aged Care Collaboration.
Thank you, Senator. Given that we're representing a number of groups, we do have a prepared statement. So the Australian Aged Care Collaboration is a group of 6 organisations that represents over 1,000 aged care services, providing care and support to over 1 million older Australians. The members that we have provide a mix of care and support in a range of settings, including aged care homes, in-home care in the community, and retirement living and seniors housing. We absolutely acknowledge that the Royal Commission into Quality and Safety in Aged Care affords the once-in-a-generation opportunity to address fundamental and structural problems that have plagued our aged care system for decades in order to realise better outcomes for older Australians, not only today but also into the future. And we note that the Royal Commission's headline finding was that the aged care system in its current state is unacceptable and unsustainable. Now, the collaboration fully supports the Royal Commission's intent to transform Australia's aged care system. But when we consider the pathway to realise this transformation, we've urged government to work with us and with other key stakeholders and to focus on 3 things: taking account of the operating context into which we're seeking to implement change, ensuring an appropriate process to realise that change, and having a detailed understanding of the content of what the actual changes are. And I'd like to expand briefly on these points because this is, I think, fundamentally important to the discussion we will have around the reform bill that you're looking into. So with respect to context, the current aged care system is not adequately meeting the needs of all older Australians in need, and does not resource or enable aged care workers or providers to consistently deliver the best possible care. Right now, many services are struggling to find workers. Financial pressures due to inadequate resourcing continue to grow, which puts further stress and pressure on the workforce. And we continue to do all we can to focus on what's really important, that is keeping older Australians safe and well, particularly through a pandemic. And whilst we're trying to fight that pandemic, we're also fighting to find workers and fighting to keep the doors open. And what we see is little acknowledgement of this context in the process that is now being employed to realise the reform agenda. Now, with regards to that process, what we're finding now in what we're currently looking at is we wrote as a reform collective to ministers after the government released their 5-pillar 5-year reform plan in May. And in this correspondence, we stated our strong commitment to realise the transformation of the aged care system, to work collaboratively with government and the other stakeholders. And with this in mind, we provided a discussion paper outlining the principles that must underpin the reform process if we're to be successful. Now, these principles were based on the UN's Good Governance Principles for Social Policy Reform, and talks about effective and inclusive and transparent governance, participatory and inclusive design, so stakeholders impacted by change are active participants in the design of the change, and bringing a change management mindset to implementation so the key stakeholders are enabled and supported to implement changes effectively and within agreed timeframes. Now, unfortunately, as we've indicated in our submission to this committee, the reform process to date is not consistent with this good practice and runs the risk of not achieving the outcomes we all desire. And that plays into the third area, because this is evident in the content of some of the changes proposed in Reform Bill number 2. So with regards to the content in that bill, we've stated in our submission, we support in principle most of the reforms contained in the bill. However, due to a lack of acknowledgement of the context in which these proposed changes are seeking to be realised, and due to the inadequacy of the reform process to date, there are a number of key areas within the bill that require detailed examination and revision. And I'll just quickly throw to Paul Sadler from Aged and Community Services Australia, who'll provide just a very brief overview on some of those areas we'd like to draw the committee's attention to.
Senator, I'm very conscious of the time with three of us presenting in this session, so I'll keep this very brief. We've identified two areas where we've recommended there be amendments to the bill. The first is around the Code of Conduct, and that's an area where we believe we need to protect low-income workers from potential miscarriages of justice, but also to exclude professional staff from the Code's remit so there's no duplication with professional registration obligations. The second area we've recommended amendments is governance. We do need to ensure that any new legislative obligations in the bill promote meaningful improvement to quality of care without actually being detrimental to the provision of care in areas like remote Australia or for diverse communities. We've also identified 4 areas where we do believe we need to understand the government's intent better, particularly around delegated legislation. So the first of those is around the introduction of the new funding tool, the Australian National Aged Care Classification. We really believe that there's some provisions that were recommended by the University of Wollongong, who developed ANAC, that have not been put into place in this bill, and we're concerned about that. Second area is worker screening, where we're receiving regular feedback now about cost impacts for prospective staff members and for delays in workers' check under the NDIS model, which is now the one that's being recommended for this bill. Third area is the extension of the Serious Incident Response Scheme into home care. Again, we support this, but we do need to make sure that the scope of that new requirement is actually proportionate to what aged care providers actually can manage in somebody's own home. And finally, in terms of the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority, again, we support the expansion of the authority's remit to cover aged care. We're concerned that it covers the full scope of aged care, including home care pricing issues, and that there is a requirement on the authority to regularly report both to Parliament and the public around the work that it's doing and the financial impact on the aged care sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Did we have a third person who's presenting? No, we've done. So we'll now go to Palliative Care Australia for their opening statement.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee. As in accordance with our submission, we'd like to really highlight a few of the key points that we made. Firstly, I'd like to state that we support the aged care collaboration in terms of the principles of reform that they have put forward, and we are supportive of all aspects of that. The first point we'd like to raise is around the register for the personal care workforce. We believe that there should be minimum qualifications, ongoing training, professional support that aligns with other professions. However, we should also think that perhaps the Commission is not the appropriate forum to manage the registration and to look to other bodies such as APRA who could explore doing this. We would also look to seeking more rigour around the process, including the funding for APRA in terms of undertaking this work. In relation to the Code of Conduct, we do believe that individual conduct should be included in the registration scheme and support of Code of Conduct, but we're interested to see how that is administered. And again, reflecting on what the Aged Care Collaboration said, we do not want individuals to go through a process that is challenging for many individuals, but more about looking at a systemic approach. The other area that we want to ensure is around incident management, and we support an increase in professionalism of quality care and protection of vulnerable people. And therefore we recommend that incident management is incorporated, but there needs to be clear scoping of what is meant by incident management and how that occurs. Further, we would also like to add that we would like to see 24-hour registered nurses in each aged care facility. due to the information that we have as a palliative care sector, that the majority of residents in residential aged care facilities do seek palliative care services at some point, and many are unable to access that. And the presence of a registered nurse 24 hours or registered nurses 24 hours in aged care facilities will help to provide and oversee that palliative care services within their residential aged care facilities. Finally, in relation to the ANAC, we are concerned about the pricing. This is important, and we want to see what the funding formula looks like. Whilst we support the ANAC as it has been developed in principle, we are yet to see more clearly what the funding formulas are to make sure that this is administered and resources are adequately, appropriately addressed.
Okay, thank you very much for those opening statements. I'll now go to Senator Green to start with our questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you everyone for attending today and for your submissions. They're very useful. I just want to go straight to the AACC just in regards to some of the issues you brought up in your submission and the opening statement today. And I guess the first issue is in regards to broader concerns about the reform process that this bill fits into. I know you mentioned that in your opening statement, but do you think that the government has provided enough transparency about the pathway of reform that we're heading towards, or are we just seeing sort of piece by piece at the moment?
I might start with the response there, Senator Green. We've written to the responsible ministers on a number of occasions and met with them and their advisors and also senior bureaucrats to discuss the current reform plan. What we're currently working off is a very high-level glossy document, for want of a better term, which doesn't really give us the level of detail that we need to be able to meaningfully engage in a genuine transformation. And that's the challenge. It'd be no surprise to ministers or bureaucrats that that's our position. And we consistently ask for a detailed pathway, roadmap, mudmap, whatever we want to describe it as, because we're going to have to go on this journey together. And if we don't have that detail, if we don't do this together, we run the risk of failing older Australians now and into the future. And we have an appalling track record in this country of reforming the aged care system. And none of us on this call want to see that repeated into the future.
Thank you. And you would have, I'm not sure if you heard the evidence from witnesses before you throughout the day. We've been hearing a lot about the workforce issue. So I was just wondering, you mentioned that obviously the workforce issue is becoming critical. In terms of the members that you represent and the organisations that you represent, can you expand on that a little bit? And do you have any concerns about the contents of this bill and how it might fit into workforce availability?
I'm happy to lead off on that one, Senator. I think the short answer on the workforce issue is we know there's been a long-term issue about the challenges in the workforce. They were highlighted in the A Matter of Care report, the Aged Care Workforce Strategy, and of course in the evidence to the Royal Commission and in the Royal Commission's reports. What we're seeing now is, thanks to the pandemic, that what was a long-term crisis, a long-term challenge, has now become a short-term crisis. The pandemic has really affected us in three ways.
Yes.
We've had the closure of the international borders, and a substantial proportion of new workers in aged care did come in from international locations. Second issue is we've seen, obviously, the impact of vaccination requirements, other requirements, a level of fear for some staff about whether, working in an area, would they putting themselves, their own families at risk? So there's been some level of people leaving the sector due to that. And the third issue is we're in direct competition with the health sector, who, for example, are employing registered nurses out of university to man the vaccination clinics. So we're really finding that the challenge is quite significant at the moment. So the Australian Aged Care Collaboration actually wrote to Ministers Hunt and Colbeck last week with us a range of suggestions for some short-term action that could be taken to alleviate the pressures. In terms of the impact of this bill, that's why we've got some concerns, for example, about the worker screening component. Anything that adds another barrier to people coming into aged care, be that a financial barrier or just a regulatory timing barrier, is not going to help us in the short term.
Thank you, Mr. Sadler. And I think some of the concerns that you've raised were raised by other witnesses just in regards to the screening. I mean, I think everyone appreciates that these provisions or these protections do need to be implemented, but it's how we go about implementing them while we're in the middle of this, as you call it, short-term crisis. Can you just, on notice, if you're comfortable sharing that letter with the committee, we'd love to see a copy to understand those issues better. And obviously you have to, the organisations that have written the letter will have to give consent to that. But if everyone's happy, that would be good.
Senator,
my next question is...
So I was going to say, we are planning to publicly release that document later this week, so we're happy to provide that once that occurs to the committee. Thank
you, Mr. Sadler. The other question I had was in regards to the transition to ANACC funding, which has been raised. I'm curious about the impact that this might have on safety and care of residents. Being committee members, maybe not fully understanding how a funding model might impact care and safety. Could you just elaborate on that for us?
Maybe I'll open the batting on that one and see if my colleagues want to chime in, but it also affects the other people participating in today's discussion.
Sure.
The ANAC really is the tool through which the government subsidy would be applied with respect to the care needs of each individual. Now, some of the challenges with the ANAC in its present form is it was based on activity costings, basically time and motion studies done about 2 years ago now. And that was based on standard practices in aged care homes where the Royal Commission has found that those standard practices really are inadequate to meet the holistic care needs of residents in aged care homes. So already the starting point would seem to be that we are working on a tool that doesn't reflect leading practice. We also note that the Royal Commission has recommended and government has accepted that there should be an expansion of the indicators with regards to quality, and that should be expanded to include not only clinical indicators, but indicators around wellbeing and quality of life, and that we also have a revision of the quality standards, which also needs to be taken into account. So what we need to find is an alignment between what is the standard of care that we are wanting to deliver. How do we actually measure that standard through appropriate indicators that are expansive enough to take into account wellbeing and quality of life? And then from that basis, then determine what is the appropriate way to allocate funds to ensure those needs are being met. And at the moment, what we have is an ANAC, which is really a black box, that we know that there are 13 care categories. The government has a widget that will put some inputs in. The black box will do its trick, and then out will come a level of subsidy to each aged care home. And I think that's the concern that we have at the moment. And within those care categories, the level and type of service needs to include those allied health services, the palliative care services, those other things that contribute to the experience of an older person ageing well and dying well in an aged care home.
And I will say, I guess, to the other witnesses as well, I've got some specific questions for you, but if you feel that this is something relevant that you want to jump in on, then please feel free. I know that everyone will have their different views on that funding model and the transition to it.
Senator Green, would you mind if I just commented?
Of course.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sean, for mentioning allied health, and also I was going to mention just the important role of physio and allied health in palliative care as well, and how important that is. We have many palliative clients to look after. But I just was going to come back to that question you sort of asked about the transparency, I suppose, around this. The ANAC is a very complicated model that was based on a lot of research that is for physiotherapists and others who don't work in it. I'm a frontline physio, and what I can tell you is the most common question we're asked repeatedly, myself, in our company and other physios who've contacted me, is what will mum and dad do about physiotherapy after October 2022 and who will pay for it? So the very fact that that is not clear, and we've been asking questions probably for the last 12 months in different forms, which I'm very happy to send the committee responses we've had from the government, which are very unclear about how that's going to happen. And essentially it comes down to the quality standards will protect the level of physiotherapy and allied health, despite the fact that it doesn't now. And the funding is not there in the new model for it either. So I don't understand, and I've read a lot of information about this, exactly how physiotherapy and allied health is funded, despite those responses I had from Senator Colbeck. And Lou O'Brien, my local member, who I contacted about my mum-in-law, who I'm worried about what will happen to her. So if I don't know, I would be wondering how many people know how physiotherapy and allied health is going to be funded after next year. And that was our call in our submission, was there needs to be a lot more clarification, as Sean was saying, about the actual ratio, because I don't think it's fair to blame nursing homes. I work with some very good nursing homes, and if people don't get their physio and allied health, I don't think it's going to be an oversight or a lack of care from nursing homes and their organisations who represent them. A lot of them encouraged me to make a submission too, because they're not allowed to, or they didn't want to do it for whatever reason, but they said that, yes, they would support that, because it's not in dispute that physio and allied health is needed in aged care, but the very fact that this is in doubt, and to the point that the Australian Physio Association is openly talking about the job losses of 6,000 physiotherapists in our system, is just appalling. It shouldn't have come to this point, and it's still not clear. So people leaving our industry in droves, and that will affect other parts of the workforce, including RNs. So sorry, I get a bit upset about that part, because it's really...
Of course, I've been on the back end of some pretty vague answers from the government myself, so I appreciate what that feels like. Perhaps if you did want to forward those responses to the committee, and we certainly have an opportunity to ask the department questions later in this session, so we'll raise that with them as well and try to get some clearer answers for you.
Senator, can we add to that conversation as well?
Of course.
We would support that, the delivery of palliative care, like it's just crucial to have allied health. You can't deliver it without. And I think our big concern around the ANAC would be the delivery of allied health and enough registered nurses in aged care. And at the moment, it's not clear how that would be funded under that model. And I think that, we would stress very clearly that if we really want to deliver take aged care to the next step and deliver a professional level of care and have things like palliative care delivered, we need an answer on how allied health and nursing would be funded.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to the workforce issue just quickly around the code of conduct and banning orders in terms of the AACC's position. We've heard some evidence today already about some concerns. I think you've used the language in your submission around the risk of miscarriages of justice. Can I just understand, I just want to understand what you mean by that. We had it raised by some of the unions around procedural fairness for workers when these things are implemented. Is that what you're referring to when it comes to code of conduct and banning orders?
Yes, I think it is. I'm wondering whether I might flick to Tim Hicks to comment on this section for us.
Thanks, Paul. When we use the term miscarriages of justice, we're using it broadly. But what we're getting at there is that particularly for low-income workers, but to be honest, even for organisations, smaller organisations and their management, responding to an accusation of misconduct is a big deal, and it requires significant time, significant attention, and a degree of process and procedure is needed around that accusation to ensure the right outcome. Otherwise, there's a serious risk that people will be found to have engaged in misconduct because they didn't have the resources to defend themselves appropriately.
And in terms of palliative care, I noticed that you've put forward the the idea that aged care workers should be covered by an appropriate body such as APRA. Is that part of the concern around these code of conducts and banning orders, that there needs to be a process and an independent process in place to be able to assess the issue but also give a right of reply and go through the process?
Yes, we feel if it went through a body like APRA, they're set up and they have the appropriate processes to deal with something like that, like a workplace conduct, issue. We feel too that you're talking about a workforce that is lowly paid. We know a large number of people come from non-English speaking backgrounds, have low educational rates, and then you're exposing them to a code of conduct with no clear guidance about how they would be supported through that process, and in fact they can end up with a large financial penalty at the end, and we're not sure that, I don't think that that's the answer in terms of giving large fines to personal care workers. Instead, if it goes through a professional body, it can be dealt with in a process that's already been sort of thought through and supports the person. And we would say the same for any kind of level of worker in the aged care.
Yeah, no, I take that on board. It's you can imagine that right now, the information that we have, the details that we have, we don't know how those workers will be supported. And you would assume that they would need to sort of engage legal professionals to deal with something like that at an industrial level. And that is, as someone who used to work in a workplace law firm, very expensive process for people who aren't represented by possibly an industrial officer at a union or something like that. So it's a very costly process for workers who are already paid pretty low wages. Can I just come to Carers New South Wales? I did have a specific question about one of the submissions, issues that you raised in your submission. It's just in regards to the expansion of the serious incident response scheme into home care. And I just wanted to understand what the concerns or issue around that expansion would be. I think everyone sort of supports the serious incident response scheme more generally, but it isn't really clear how that will be expanded into home care and what the effects might be. We've got Carers New South Wales? No. Okay.
They didn't join us in the end, I don't think.
Okay, sorry about that. I thought they might have joined us and they might not have been on the screen because you can only have a couple of people on the screen. That's okay. I have one more question and then I can hand it over to another senator. The last question I had is just in regards to the pricing authority, which is in Schedule 8 of the bill. It's a very large bill, so all the way down into Schedule 8. Just wanted to understand, in terms of the way it's currently drafted, have you got confidence that the pricing authority will be independent and transparent enough to be able to perform its role effectively?
So, Senator, I think the short answer is no, we don't have complete confidence. We recognise that the provisions around the expansion into aged care make sense. That the detail around how that will happen, I guess we'll wait and see in the delegated legislation again. But we are concerned that it appears the government has taken the opportunity of this expansion of role to change the way in which the board and the CEO are appointed and to make that a ministerial discretion issue. That doesn't give us huge confidence that this body that needs to be independent for both the hospital sector, but particularly from our point of view for the aged care sector, it doesn't give us confidence that that level of independence will necessarily be maintained.
And I think, Senator, I also might add that the remit of the actual costings undertaken by the independent authority really isn't clear at this point in time. Currently, with residential aged care, we have 3 levels of costing. There's accommodation, there's hotel services, which is laundry and other supports, and then there's the clinical services through the ACFI, but in the future will be through the ANAC. Now, we're not clear if the independent authority is going to look at all 3 of those streams of activity or only the care side of it. And similarly, we're not sure what the arrangements would be with respect to in-home care. So not only the structures, but also the scope of the actual costing activity was important for us to know, but also transparently for everybody to understand, again, through the Royal Commission process, a very clear call from pretty well everybody to understand how much money goes into aged care, what that money is spent on, and what is the outcomes that are achieved for older Australians through that investment from the public purse.
And sorry, one more question, Mr. Blaze. I just want to go back to you for a second. I noticed you mentioned that you live in Lou O'Brien's electorate, so I assume that means you live in regional Queensland. And I just wanted to understand, you know, I live in Cairns in regional Queensland as well, and it does seem to me that there is a different level of care that people in regional areas are receiving. And is that some of the concern that you have as well, and why you've felt the need to raise the issues around this bill, but around the reform process more broadly?
Yeah, thank you. We're actually in Cairns as well. So it's we work in regional Queensland, and that's been one of my passions, has always been to fill gaps of areas where they haven't had physio. So there's a place up in Atherton, for example, before we were there, didn't have physios at all for a couple of years, and the ACFI funding model, despite all its problems, enabled us to be there. Before the pandemic, the Australian Physio Council said that there were 6,000 physios short in Australia, and that got worse in the pandemic because we had about 3/4 of physios working in aged care come from overseas. It's a very difficult issue to find physios in allied health right now in aged care, and that's only going to get worse. So especially because, as I said, professional associations like the Australian Physio Association are openly talking about job losses. So if you're a physio working in aged care at the moment, which is a challenging industry to work in right now, up until October next year, you can see the writing on the wall, that there's no transparency around how it's going to be funded. And yeah, that's a real challenge in regional areas. It just means that, and I've had private conversations with other allied health companies who said things even amongst this ACFI time, if they had restrictions, for example, as were there in 2018 on the ability for limited registration physios to work in regional areas, that they would just stop providing physio in regional areas because it wasn't cost effective to do so. So it's a real challenge anyway to get allied health. So your short answer is yes, unfortunately, regional areas are going to miss out even more so. I imagine it would concentrate in the cities and the physios that are left like that. But yeah, I don't have a great deal of confidence there's going to be anywhere near the workforce we've got now, and neither do other professional associations. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thanks very much. Senator Rice.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. And look, thank you all for presenting to us today for your submissions. I've got a range of areas, but I'll start continuing on with you, Mr. Blaze, as your concerns about allied health professionals, and they're not enough of them at the moment, and it's going to get worse. What's needed to turn that around?
It's really pretty simple. The actual author of the ANAC that everybody seems to be supportive of this model coming in called for allied health to be embedded in it with separate mandated minutes of 22 minutes per day, which was based on recognised international standards. That recommendation has not come across, despite the fact that recommendation 38 from the Royal Commission accepted the need for more allied health than the 8 minutes a day at the moment. So it's really very simple. We need the same level of mandated separate funding and minimum minutes for allied health and physiotherapy in aged care. We know what the numbers are. So if those numbers got mandated and they were included, that would give certainty to physios and allied health, at this time.
So would you prefer to see, rather than introducing the ANAC in this legislation without all that detail, would you prefer to see it delayed so that we can actually ensure that that detail is there and that ANAC is going to be the appropriate model?
I was really excited about the ANAC when it was first proposed because the whole aim of it was rehabilitation and restorative care, which doesn't exist at the moment, and the Royal Commission confirmed that, especially in regards to physio and allied health. So I'd be very supportive. I'm quite a realist. I believe the ANAC is going to come in, and I think it's a matter of time. It's already been talked about in October next year, but when you can hear these sort of concerns from esteemed people in our industry about the level of detail, I've also read things from Kathy Eagers and others in the ANAC about that it's a significant change to the health system, and that does require time to work out the detail. We haven't even finished the shadow ANAC assessments and had the results analysed of that. So yes, we would be very supportive of more time to clarify, particularly how we can, as I said at the start, how do mum and dad get physio after October next year? It's a pretty simple question, and yet it hasn't been answered.
Senator Rice, can I please add to Mr Blazer's comments?
We're going to ask for the rest of you to comment on that too.
Thank you.
Yes.
We would totally support what he said, because we know that after the first 22 months of the majority of residents entering into aged care facilities, the majority will die in the first 22 months. So if we accept that research outcome, we know that palliative care is not just about nursing, it is also about allied health. And it's really important to Palliative Care Australia and all palliative care services across Australia that it's embedded in aged care settings. And that is one of our core focus areas for our strategic plan going forwards, and for our one of our principles in terms of supporting the reform in aged care. So that means it's not just the nursing and the visiting doctors, it's also about allied health. And we'd also like to make comment that at the moment, specialist palliative care services can do some telehealth, but there are many contexts where that is not suitable, and that we require not just visiting staff, but staff embedded within the aged care system.
So would you prefer to see a delay in its introduction until you can be assured that it's going to be implemented appropriately with embedding allied health into the funding model?
Yes, because if the introduction of the NDIS is anything to learn from, and both my colleague and I have been involved in understanding the NDIS from its inception, is that they didn't ensure at the beginning of the major reforms that everything was addressed in terms of the assessment, the funding, and therefore some years down the track we're still addressing some of the major issues that exist within that system of the NDIS. So because we're talking about major reform, as all the other participants here today have said, we actually really want to see that up front we have as many of these systemic issues addressed as soon as possible, including the ANAC.
Mr Rooney and Mr Sadler, what's your view?
So I might have a go first. As Mr Rooney said earlier, we do see that ANAC is being introduced in the context of a range of changes in the government's response to the Royal Commission, including issues around quality, palliative care, quality standards, quality indicators. So there is a broader remit, which I'm sure the department will point to you. I'm not sure delaying the implementation of ANAC is necessarily the answer here. The preliminary work for the ANAC was done now back 3 or 4 years ago. As our other colleagues here have indicated, Professor Cathy Eager and the Australian Health Services Research Institute team that created the ANAC did make some very clear recommendations, and in the work they did for the Royal Commission, they recommended allied health be part of the mandated staffing numbers, and that would also include a mandate around registered nurses. We would be urging that those original recommendations from the University of Wollongong be adopted, both in terms of the ANAC and in terms of the related measure around staffing numbers. And I believe that if we got a commitment from the government to do that, there wouldn't really be a need to delay ANAC implementation.
But would you like to see them reflected in this legislation that we are now considering?
I think that's probably a technical question about whether they need to be in the legislation. The government, in fairness to it, has made the commitment around this mandated staffing ratios. That hasn't yet come before Parliament in a bill. So we do need to see again the detail of what the government's going to do around that. And that goes to Sean Rooney's earlier point about we need the plan for how all these pieces fit together.
And I think, Senator, this discussion really highlights that real reform, meaningful reform, is actually a team sport. And at the moment, we don't have all the players on the field, if I can extend the analogy. We don't have a game plan. What we have is government with doing a lot of work. There's no argument, there's lots of work going on. But because we're not actively involved where we should be, and I'm sure there's going to be areas where there's no need for us to be actively involved, but when there are decisions being made that will impact on people delivering care and services and the funding that they receive, as well as the outcomes that will be delivered for older Australians. Those people rightfully need to be involved in those design discussions, because at the end of the day, it'll fall upon them to be able to deliver that change. And that's what we highlighted in our correspondence to government back in June.
Okay. And just on the ANAC, you said in your submission, I mean, one of your concerns was that the shadow assessment outcomes are not being made available to people who have been assessed or their providers. Could you just comment on why that's a concern?
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond to that, Senator. So the shadow assessment process is an extensive program. It's 190 odd thousand, I think, residents needing to be assessed. So it is an extensive program for the department to undertake. At this stage, we anticipate it may not be completed till around April next year. The concerns that we've raised for some time is that providers need to understand the potential impact on their budgets for the 2022-2023 financial year. They need to understand the potential impact of ANAC on their funding so that they can forward budget and plan for the provision of their services and the continuity of their services. So we've seen on the Eastern Seaboard with the pandemic and the lockdown environment that I think the shadow assessment process is further behind than the department has anticipated it would be at this stage. So our concern is that if the department waits to the completion of the process before they release the data to the sector, then the sector is not going to have that data, is not going to understand what their funding profile is going to be at an individual provider level in the transition from ACFI to ANAC, that they're not going to understand that in time for their next budget period. And with the transfer from ACFI to ANAC, if they are to experience a financial loss, that they need to understand that beforehand, before the new budget year, the new financial year commences. So we've argued fairly consistently for some time for the department to start to release even preliminary data so that they can start to talk to the sector about what they're seeing, the patterns they're seeing in the 80 or 90 odd thousand assessments they've done to date, what that is showing them in terms of a change, in terms of a change from the ACFI profile to the ANAC profile. And we've been asking for some time that that information is released, even in preliminary form.
Mm. And I mean, we can ask the department about this when they're on, as to when they expect to be able to release that information. But, you know, when should the deadline be? I mean, obviously by now would have been preferable, but when does it just become untenable to then introduce a new funding instrument that is going to, you know, change the arrangements for the next financial year?
Well, I think the answer is now, ideally, but if I go back to a former life when I was a general manager for in an aged care provider, I would have said by February, you know, when we start to do the financial planning. Now, Mr. Sadler and Mr. Rooney may have some counter views to that, but I would have said ideally by at least February, not April or May, when budgets are close to being closed off and finalised and approved by boards.
I mean, I might just add in there. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, the resourcing that is provided to the aged care homes through the ACFI and then through the ANAC is the funding that's then, you know, applied to meeting the care needs of individuals. I mean, those individuals, their families have a right to know what is the funding that's going to be made available to the service in order to maintain a high quality of standard of care. And we know the starting point is the current system isn't delivering that. And so we've got to be assured as a resident, as a family member, as a worker, as a provider, as a government, as a community, we've got to be assured that we are resourcing the system to the level that's needed to do the job to the standard. And that's the concern. At the moment, we don't have any insight into whether it's going to be the same, better or different.
So, Senator Ross, could I just very quickly, just from a physio allied health perspective, it's already too late. We do contracts 12 months in advance. We launched our campaign on October because it's exactly a year until, we've been saying. We have had a contract specifically terminated, citing the lack of clarity about the ANAC, and I've got another one that potentially is there. I've heard this from other providers as well. If people think this is a physio-allied health problem, it's not, because nursing homes rely on a lot of their funding from the provision of physiotherapy pain management at the moment, particularly. It's at least 3 or 4 times what most providers, groups like physios get paid, goes to nursing homes. There's going to be a big hole in budgets when the workforce issues we talked about before come through. So I believe that this will hit a lot sooner than October, if they think physios and OTs and others are magically going to keep working up until October next year without any clarification about how we'll stay there. We're not going to magically stay in a broken system that doesn't clearly fund us in the new system, as was called for by that. So I think it's already too late from our perspective. And I've had good friends of mine who run other companies saying that they are going to have to lay off friends of theirs and therapists in their team, which is appalling. It is so hard to get good physios and OTs anyway. And if they're leaving our profession because of their lack of confidence and transparency, I just think that's an absolute tragedy.
Absolutely, the last thing that we need. I know I'd better move on because we're running short of time. Another 10 minutes left. And I did want to go to some more the issues relating to the code of conduct, which all of your submissions have addressed, and we've heard a lot of evidence this morning. Again, the collaboration in your submission, you said that the approach outlined in the bill unfortunately does little to advance the more fundamental issue for quality of care, which is the need to upskill and professionalise the personal care workforce. And that was very much what we heard in evidence this morning, the sort of concerns with the code, or that's not addressing the fundamental issues. Could you you'd like to just expand on your concerns with the code, and in particular then going to the issues of what, the problems with it stands at the moment?
I'm happy to kick off that one, and then others can add to it. So the code, as we understand, we don't know what's going to be in the code yet. It's not been made available to us. It'll be in delegated legislation, and that's a problem in its own right, given the level of penalties that are attached to it. And you'll see in the Law Council's submission, they've drawn attention to that issue too. At least in principle, the elements of something that attaches such a significant civil penalty should be in primary legislation. But let's assume that it's going to be similar to the NDIS code, because that's what all the indications we've been given have been. That's a very high level code that talks about very general principles of behaviour. Now, all of that is important, but as others have said, for health professionals, they're already covered by more comprehensive codes of conduct for their respective professions, and there are much more extensive procedural arrangements around the enforcement. Not just the enforcement, but also the promulgation of that code into the behaviour of those professionals in the first place. For the aged care code, our concern is it will sit there in the background. It will be used in the context of banning orders when there are obvious cases of misconduct. And as we've indicated in our submission, it is important that we're able to ensure that people who do engage in serious misconduct aren't able to continue to work within the industry. But it doesn't go to the issue of minimum qualifications. It doesn't go to the issue of professional ethics and a professional feeling of, I guess, the degree of respect that's afforded a registered profession. Now, moving to a registered profession, moving to minimum qualifications is a big step. It's a very hard step. We don't have the leadership group of personal care workers that we do for those registered professions. And so it's not something we should have any illusions is possible to move to overnight. But what we're really concerned about with the code of conduct is essentially we'll tick that box, say that it's done, and won't go to solving the more fundamental problem.
Thanks, Mr. Hicks. Can I just, the issue for me in terms of, where in consideration of this legislation is if this code isn't addressing the sort of underlying issues, if it's got the potential to be, have procedural unfairness, excessive penalties for workers vis-a-vis organisations if they are actually the ones being negligent, what's the value of implementing it now? Or again, should we be getting the framework in place, the roadmap in place, the training in place before we then have a code consistent with that? So I'm interested in your response to that.
Senator, I'll have a go at that one. I think one of the reasons why a code of conduct is valuable and why we've said that we have some concerns which we believe need to be amended, we're still supportive overall, is we do know at the moment that in the aged care system, if you're somebody who's assaulted another resident, if you're highly unlikely to be charged because the evidentiary requirements to get to a criminal threshold are really difficult to do, where the victim may have dementia, they may not have been witnessed, all of those sorts of things. So the amount of time that somebody who participates in elder abuse is actually removed under our current structure is very limited. We do see some value in having a mechanism where real abusers of older people can be prevented from just going down the road and getting employed by another aged care service.
But ideally, you'd want to have the framework of training and addressing the sort of conditions and in place at the same time as you were introducing that code.
Absolutely, and picking up the other comments we've made in here about not overlapping with health professional registration requirements, etc.
Look, my final comment on the code is just, the government has indicated it's going to be based on the NDIS code. Whether you feel that is entirely appropriate, or should there be, will there need to be differences compared with the NDIS code?
Sorry, Paul.
You go to.
Look, I think that's an issue we're going to need to work through in detail with our members when we see what's specifically proposed. I think there's some elements of the wording used in the NDIS code that are a little bit unclear, but there's also some attached guidance that the disability regulator provides that provides some clarification to that. Let me put it this way. It would be much better for us to look at the disability code and say, is it working well? Has it worked well in the disability space? Are there amendments and clarifications that are needed? And let's try to come up with a code that works well for both sectors and is clear and is useful, because at the end of the day, both aged care and disability care is social care to a vulnerable group, and the general expectation should be similar. So what we wouldn't want is just taking the NDIS code with no consideration at all on applying it to aged care.
Senator Ross, a lot of allied health and physios are particularly quite critical of the NDIS and the complexity around it. External assessments, are not necessarily a bad thing. I think it could be a good thing in aged care if they have that, but the devil's always in the detail of the way those assessments are done. I just really hope, like Sean was saying, that they listen to the team, batting together on multidisciplinary care, because we know what residents need. If nursing homes, the residents and allied health carers are all contributing together to come up with that, I think it's great. But the way it currently stands, if it is based on the NDIS and that external assessment model, there's absolutely nothing in there, and that was confirmed by the Department of Health in a response to us, to prescribe physiotherapy, etc. And homes in financial distress, etc. That we've been reading about and hearing about. I don't think it's fair to expect them to provide a care that they probably know is needed, other than the bare minimum that they'd have to do to be able to afford a service that I'm sure they'd like. So yeah, the external assessment model, as I said, is not particularly popular amongst allied health right now.
Senator, can I just add as well, I think one of the major issues with this bill is, on the one hand, we're saying under the Code of Conduct, we're going to hold workers of all levels to a higher professional standard. But then on the other hand, when it comes to something like a registration scheme, we're not elevating the personal care worker to, we're not supporting them for it to become a professional position, with qualifications and industry support and things like that. So they don't balance out.
And they all should be part of an integrated framework. And yes, and we're not seeing all of that framework with this initial legislation. Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, and well timed, Senator Rice. Thank you everyone for making yourselves available today. That's concluded our questioning. However, if there is anything else that you'd like to send through to us, feel free to provide it to the Secretariat, although questions on notice are due by tomorrow, so by tomorrow afternoon. But if there is anything you'd like to provide to us, please feel free to send it through. And we'll be reporting to the Senate next week on the 16th of November. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No. I'm not sure whether we have all of our departmental representatives online or not.
You do, Senator. Can you see us or not?
No, I can't see you, but I'm sure I'll be able to at some point. I can see our Commissioner, that's a start. But I still can't see the department anyway. Oh, there you are. Oh, welcome. Okay, so I now welcome representatives from the Department of Health and the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. Thank you all for appearing before us. I'm Wendy Askew, Chair of the committee, and I have Senator Rice and Senator Green with me. I think not sure if we've got Senator McLaughlin and Senator Polly have been joining us throughout the day. So I remind witnesses that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanation of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Before we begin, could I ask you to please state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript? So perhaps go around the table in the department.
Okay, Senator, Michael Lai, Deputy Secretary, Ageing and Aged Care Group in the Department of Health.
Thank you.
Melanie Metz, Assistant Secretary, Legislative Reform Branch. Amy Laffin, First Assistant Secretary, Quality and Assurance Division.
Gillian Shaw, Assistant Secretary of Harmonisation and Regulatory Strategy Branch.
Rob Montefiore-Gardner, I'm Director of Policy and Legislation in the Annex Space.
Mark Richardson, Assistant Secretary, Residential Care Funding Reform.
Elisa Stratt, First Assistant Secretary, Market and Workforce Division.
Jessica Evans, Assistant Secretary, Structural Adjustment Strategy Branch.
And I know I have the Commissioner in her separate screen.
Janet Anderson, Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner.
Thank you. And I've also got, have I got other department staff separately?
Yes, Senator. Katie Holm, Assistant Secretary, Strengthening Providers Branch in the department.
Thanks, Ms Holm.
And Bethine Carl, Assistant Secretary, National Health Reform Branch.
Thank you. Is that everybody? Okay, so yes, on that basis, we might move on to see if you invite the department to make a brief opening statement, if you have one that you'd like to present.
Senator, I think that we've provided the script of an opening statement to the committee, and so rather than take your time and go through that, I'll take that as read, but I did want to just make one comment that responds in broad terms to some of the evidence given today. If that's
happy for you to proceed with that.
I think it relates to the idea that we might delay or put off the passage or seek to delay the passage of legislation so that we can consult on subordinate legislation. It's the department's position that It's very important that we get timely passage of this bill. It's necessary to progress recommendations and timeframes proposed by the Royal Commission. And there's a high degree of interdependence between this legislation and other reform work that we're doing that relates to residential aged care funding, worker regulation, extending the serious incident response scheme to home care and driving improved provider governance. The legislation is coat hanger legislation in the sense that we're establishing a framework for subordinate legislation, and that we do intend across all areas of subordinate legislation to consult with stakeholders and obviously provide that material to the Senate for scrutiny, and that the Senate has the ability to disallow that legislation. And so we're not seeking to get people to sign up to something to then prevent them being able to alter the course of the subordinate legislation that we're going to bring forward. We're very committed to consultation on that, on each and every bit of that that we bring forward. That was really a kind of something I wanted to emphasise. We're obviously we have a very tight time frame to meet the Royal Commission's timetable in terms of recommendations, which is why we feel there's a sense of urgency with this legislation. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you very much. I'll start with Senator Green again, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. And just to address that first point, I don't know. I didn't hear witnesses implying that the passage of legislation should be delayed. I think the concern is about the level of detail available to senators and to the community and stakeholders to be able to make decision about this legislation. And it's an ongoing issue in terms of the amount of information that should be in principled legislation that is actually left to subordinate legislation and regulations. So I just wanted to clear that up. The question I have is in relation to consultation around the bill. Can you list the trade unions and worker organisations that were consulted in the drafting of this bill?
So we don't have specific consultations or individual consultations with the trade unions, but what I would say is that this legislation is heavily based on government's agreement and response to the Royal Commission recommendations. And obviously the Royal Commission had several hundred days of hearing, thousands of submissions, and that's what we've based this legislation on. And those hearings and submissions included those from trade unions.
Sure, but you didn't think to, I mean, this legislation predominantly affects workers and the way that, in terms of code of conduct, banning orders, the knowledge that they will need to be able to perform their jobs well and in a safe way. You didn't think that you needed to consult with the people that represent them?
So I'd have to confirm the details, but certainly on worker regulation, there has been some detailed consultation over the last couple of years, and unions have been part of that consultation.
I'm talking about this bill. I'm very clearly talking about this bill. There was no consultation on this bill, was there?
Senator,
for those organisations.
Senator, our point is that the parameters of this bill are very tightly aligned to the Royal Commission. So we're very clear with our stakeholders that having put the time in to put their view to an extensive Royal Commission, that we're not going to come back and then ask them the same questions that they've already provided in those, as Ms Laffin said, that various ways in which the Royal Commission consulted. So we're in an unusual situation. We're not developing legislation from scratch. We're responding to a Royal Commission.
On the Royal Commission very clearly stated that transparency and consultation when it came to the reform process was a very important to ensure the success of those reforms. Do you think in an ideal world, drafting this bill, it has been transparent and consultative as it could have been, given that you didn't consult with the people that represent the workers that are affected?
We believe, Senator, that the sum total of the process, including the Royal Commission, which took place over a number of years, and what we're doing even today, represents a good level of consultation with our stakeholders.
the Royal Commission made it clear that transparency and consultation about the reform process going forward was key to the success of the reforms. So to refer to consultation by referring to submissions that were made to the Royal Commission is not sufficient. I'll put it to you.
Senator, we were asked in Senate estimates recently about the level of consultation around the reforms, and we undertook to provide the Senate with a detailed list of consultation that departments engaged in on the reforms, and we have a forward program of engagement. So we're happy to provide that to. We're already providing that. I undertook to provide that to this committee. It's extensive.
Yeah. That's not the question I was asking. Many submitters raised concerns about some of the issues in the bills, that they're missing significant details, as we mentioned at the beginning, because most of that information will be contained in legislative instruments. Can you just explain to the committee, you said that it was a coat hanger piece of legislation. What is the plan going forward to be clear, open and transparent in terms of the consultation process, as recommended by the Royal Commission, when it comes to the details of the delegated legislation? What's the plan there?
Okay, well, I might hand over to Ms. Metz to talk about the to consultation in relation to the subordinate legislation, but the coat hanger legislation, the form of this legislation is something that we've worked on with the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. I think it mirrors in large respect the design of legislation that was undertaken for the NDIS. The aged care legislation is quite old legislation, and so we think this is a contemporary framing of the way the legislation should look. But I might hand to Ms. Metz or Ms. Latham to elaborate.
I'd just say that for each measure, there's a slightly different consultation plan. So if we're to go to worker regulation, for example, I just repeat what I said earlier and said that from February 2020, we've had a large amount of consultation with the sector, including unions, on the future of worker regulation. In terms of future consultation on that regulation for the subordinate legislation, Ms. Hull may be able to fill you in on the details of that proposed consultation.
Thank you. I'd be happy to do that. There'll be it's imminent publication of a consultation discussion paper for the Code of Conduct. It will outline how the code will work in practice and seek particular feedback against a series of questions. That will be distributed very widely throughout stakeholder networks, and we'll seek the feedback on that, which will then inform the final shape of the code, which is very heavily based, as has already been mentioned at the hearing today, on the NDIS Code of Conduct.
And just to be very crystal clear, that proposed consultation, I assume, around the Code of Conduct will include the unions that represent the workers who will be impacted by the Code of Conduct?
There'll be a series of forums that will supplement the discussion paper. So anyone is able to respond to the discussion paper and the consultation questions. And there'll be a series of forums, 5 forums conducted to go through the concepts in the discussion paper. So certainly the discussion paper would be able to be circulated right across all stakeholders, including unions.
So we'll advertise broadly. We'll advertise broadly and also invite particular organisations we know that have specific interest.
And the 5 forums, are they going to be geographically located across the country, or are they online forums? How are you planning on rolling those out?
They'll be virtual, Senator, yes.
Okay. Okay, we might come back to that. Just some around the Code of Conduct, obviously, and the pre-screening process and the banning orders. These are all 3 things that have raised some concerns. I think some of those concerns would be alleviated if there was more detail. But I'm just wondering if yourself and also the Commissioner might be able to explain how procedural fairness will be built into that process. So how a worker who is notified under the Code of Conduct that there might be misconduct, what the process will be to protect procedural fairness.
So I can start the response to that, Senator. So breaches of the Code of Conduct are civil penalties. So any breach of the Code of Conduct would have to go to a court to determine whether a civil penalty should be applied and the amount of that civil penalty, and the court would take into account things like the surrounding circumstances or the gravity of the breach. In relation to banning orders, the Commissioner would have to issue a notice to the individual notifying them that a banning order the Commissioner is considering imposing a banning order, and the person would have a right to respond to that notice. In the event that the person considers that the banning order shouldn't have been imposed, there's still AAT review available to them.
Okay. Sorry, you might have more to add, but can I just stop you? The breach of Code of Conduct, you said that's a civil penalty provision. So it goes to court. But what happens before that process? I mean, does people... There's a breach of the code and it just goes automatically to a court process, or what's the lead up to that? I mean, I'm just concerned that these are very low paid workers. We're talking about a systematic, a system that is in crisis. Some of the concerns raised about those breaches, and if there are legitimate breaches, that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where there might be a situation where there's been a complaint made and it's not substantiated. So what happens before someone has to go through a legal process through the Code of Conduct?
Senator, I might be able to add a little bit to that response.
Thank you.
Commissioner, would you like me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So the Commission will have a wide range of tools and methods and powers that will be available to it to enforce the code against approved providers. And in terms of the provider, and as well as workers and governing people in governance positions. And that will obviously have to, action will obviously have to be commensurate with and determined on a case-by-case basis, so commensurate with whatever the alleged breach is. And those sort of considerations will obviously take into account the seriousness of the issue, the appropriateness of the person's response in a particular incident, and the likelihood of further harm. And so the compliance and enforcement actions available to the Commission will, as my colleague Ms Metz referred to, be either civil-based or administrative. So in the administrative process, the actions available there might be or include education, formal warning letters, directions to comply, infringement notices and bans. So all of the regular requirements of procedural fairness and natural justice would need to apply. And the alternative, depending on the gravity of the incident, it may then be appropriate for a court-based response. And those sort of responses could include injunctions, taking action to enforce an undertaking, and or civil penalties. Obviously, the gravity of the incident would then inform whether that was an administrative or court-based response through civil penalties.
And is that
the Commissioner may want to, sorry.
Sorry, Commissioner, and is that, I'm working up what the details we have. I'm sorry if there's more information we'd like to see it, but is that, does that come down to a decision that you get to make, Commissioner? And if someone's not happy with that decision, they can go through an AAT process, is that right?
Yes, Senator, the Act does identify the Commissioner or my delegate, of course. Let me just unpack that a bit. I know what you're reaching for, and I do understand the concerns which have been articulated, because we are still to develop some of the detailed operational procedures. As you are aware, we currently deal with complaints about aged care services, and they sometimes mention individual staff members now, but often don't. We also deal with serious incident response notifications, which similarly can go to instances involving individual members of staff and or providers who were in charge of things when something went wrong. Now, I have very skilled frontline staff. I have skilled complaints officers. I have skilled serious incident investigation officers who are able to ask the right questions, ascertain the facts, interview the relevant individuals in order to reach a fact-based conclusion about what happened, why it happened, the circumstances of the event, and then on the basis of that information, make a decision about whether there is or is not a breach. So there will be a very rigorous process because we're not trifling here. We take this very seriously, as indeed all workers do. And we can distinguish between, for example, intent on the one hand and inattention on the other. And there are opportunities available to us to hold a provider to account for the performance of a worker. And I would venture that in a number of cases, that's exactly what we will do.
So you're referring to the discretion available in your internal processes. I think what I am reaching for is to understand whether there would be a right of reply for workers in that process. Is that already available through the things that you're already undertaking?
Senator, we would not undertake a review of an individual's conduct without interviewing the individual.
Well, interviewing is one thing. Having an opportunity to respond, get legal advice, put together a response in a timely manner. That's what I'm sort of talking. I'm talking about procedural fairness. Having all the information available to them that they need.
I can assure you that we would travel through this with the individual's full participation and knowledge. If you go to the far extreme, as you've already identified in the banning orders, the bill is explicit about the steps in the procedural fairness. Just to go back quickly through them, and I won't take time, I am obliged to give a notice of intention to make a banning order, give 14 days for response, and I must consider the submission back. The application of the banning order can be general or limited, permanent or for a specified period, and subject to certain conditions. So it's not all or nothing. Then I have to be satisfied of all of the conditions set out in 74BG, including holding a reasonable belief that the situation warrants the judgment and the steps I'm about to take. And then an individual may apply to have a banning order or a condition of a banning order varied or revoked. And again, there is a procedural fairness approach attached to that. It's a reviewable decision, as has already been said, which means that someone other than the commission is required to reconsider its approach, and there is an external review of that if the individual warrants it. So there are numbers of steps built into the bill which protect the rights of the individual, just as we are seeking to protect the rights of the consumer.
Thanks. I'm keen to understand in terms of the banning orders, what is the penalty scheme in the bill refers to a fine of up to $55,000 for an individual, and I understand that that's the same penalty provision or the same amount as an organisation. So can I get the department to explain the rationale of having the penalty provision at the same level as an organisation, or even just the consideration that went into what the appropriate penalty would be?
Senator,
hopefully while I'm explaining some of that and unpacking that, one of my colleagues might be able to find the exact provision for me in the bill. But the maximum civil penalties for failure to comply are really aimed at the most egregious matters, and I believe, I'll just double check this, but I believe that the penalty is the same as in the NDIS code, and that there is a difference between corporations and for individuals.
Ms. Home, I think Ms. Metz has got those.
So, Senator, just to clarify, the banning orders apply only to individuals, not to providers. So there's only one penalty unit applicable there. The penalty units I think that you might have been referring to relate to breaches of the Code of Conduct, and the penalty units there are 250 for providers, 250 for workers, and 250 for persons who are members of governing bodies. The way that those penalty units operate is that under the Regulatory Powers Act, penalties for bodies corporate can be 5 times higher than they are for individuals. So the penalty, if you're talking in dollar terms, for individuals is a maximum of $55,000, and for a body corporate, it would be a maximum of $277,500. They are equivalent to the penalties in the NDIS for breaches of the NDIS Code of Conduct, and they are maximum penalties. So, as I mentioned earlier, those civil penalties can only be imposed by a court, and the court would take into account all of the surrounding circumstances.
Okay. I mean, given it is a high maximum, I understand it's the maximum civil penalty, but it is, it's a high number for workers who are very low paid, and it relates to the Code of Conduct. So we've put the penalty provisions into the legislation for the Code of Conduct, but not the Code of Conduct itself. And I know we've sort of gone over this, but I just wanted to understand what is the basis of not including the Code of Conduct in the primary legislation? Is it to allow? I'll let you answer that.
So I can start that response, and then Katie, Ms. Home might add to it. So the Code of Conduct in the NDIS is also insubordinate legislation. So we are using that model, and the Code of Conduct is something that we will be consulting on. So, but what we have said is that it's going to be based very closely on the NDIS Code of Conduct. So there is information about what that Code of Conduct will look like. We have some flexibility with the way that we impose the code. So with the subordinate legislation, we can specify particular elements that might apply to workers or particular elements that might apply to providers. And those are the things that we need to consult on.
Okay. One of the things that's been raised by witnesses today is around the move to the new AN-ACC funding system. Although that people are generally positive, and I think that that's the overall consensus. Some submitters have expressed concern about the transitional arrangements to ensure that they don't see a drop in funding. What guarantees are in place to make sure that that doesn't happen? And I'll just, address to you the concerns raised by a previous witness about the funding of physiotherapy. What is the guarantee to make sure that there is still funding for physiotherapy under the new model?
Senator Mark Richardson. So in the Act at the moment, there's the quality of care principles. There's a schedule, Schedule 1. The schedule is specified services. That outlines the type of care that should be provided to residents by a facility. So AN-ACC is a funding model. AN-ACC is not a comprehensive assessment of someone's care needs. A facility would undertake that assessment and develop a care management plan. And then the quality of care principles that I just pointed to outlines the type of care that a facility would be required to provide. So allied health, social or leisure activities are all covered under that schedule. And if someone is assessed as requiring those, then a facility is meant to provide them.
Sorry, my question was, what guarantees are in place to ensure that there's not a drop in funding?
Senator, the residential aged care sector has been provided $7.8 billion in the budget. It's substantial funding. Government is providing a transitional grant program that's $53.3 million over 2 years, starting from 22-23. It hasn't sought to provide a stop loss gap or anything like that. Instead, it's looking to target assistance to the sector through that grant program to help facilities where there may be a funding gap.
Oh, so there could be a drop in funding for some providers.
Well, I think
is that what you're saying?
No, what Mr. Richardson is saying is that with the large increase in funding into the residential aged care sector, that's very unlikely. But given that assessments have got to be made, and remember, the context here is that under the previous funding model, some providers were able to, let's just say, maximise their funding. So some providers invested quite heavily in strategies to maximise their funding level. And this is a very different way of calculating people's funding. It's an independent process, so the provider doesn't control that. And so there may well be one or two instances where a provider who's been particularly good at doing that has effectively been able to secure funding really beyond the needs of individual consumers in their care. And so it is not impossible, notwithstanding a large increase in funding, but there will be a small number of providers who have a gap, and then they are then able to come through our targeted process to make sure that they can make it through the transition process. So I think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible, and that's why that grant funding is there.
On a similar issue, and Chair, this is probably my last question. I know other people have questions, but you might have read the submission from Hammond Care. They're a significant provider of dementia-specific residential care, and they've got concerns about what the AN-ACC model will mean in terms of whether it might overly rely on residents' physical mobility rather than cognitive ability when allocating funding. Are you aware of these concerns? Have they been raised with you? How are you going to address that so that there's not a different weighting compared to physical or cognitive ability?
So, Senator, I'll just answer one part of that question and hand over to my colleagues. Yes, Hammond Care has approached us about the model and asked us whether it will unfairly disadvantage people with dementia. The department has taken some time to work through with senior representatives of Hammond Care how the funding model works in quite some detail to assure them that we do not believe that there will be a problem for that particular service given their kind of focus on people with dementia. But as to the detail of why we think that's the case, I might hand to colleagues.
Sure. So, Senator, AN-ACC is an evidence-based model developed by the University of Wollongong. There were clinical committees that provided advice on AN-ACC and the instruments involved in the assessment process. There are 7 tools. All those tools are recognised around the world. They all have cognition as part of the assessment process. So you spoke about mobility. There's one of the tools goes to mobility. If someone was assessed as physically mobile but did not have the ability to take instructions, they would be assessed as assisted mobility. So it's taken into account as part of each of the tools, is my point, rather than there being a separate assessment in itself.
Okay, and that feedback has obviously been given to stakeholders who are concerned about it to reassure them.
That's correct, Senator. In a number of cases, for example, specialist homeless providers have asked the question about the AN-ACC funding model in relation to their services, and we have taken them through the mechanics of the model and sought to show them why it is our belief that they will not be unfairly disadvantaged by the new model. So we've done that with a range of providers, but particularly providers where they've got a specialist clientele.
Sure. Just one follow-up, Chair, and I'll hand over that. A number of people who've provided submissions or evidence today have raised the issue of retention of staff, the casualisation of staff, the lack of staff. They've raised concerns that, you know, this bill might cause some concerns for some staff. We really can't afford to lose anyone right now. We need more workers in this industry. Have you considered those risks, and are you know, can you alleviate the concerns for the committee at least that we're not going to lose any valuable staff members from this industry through this process?
Senator, I'll hand to Ms Strapp about because I think she can give you just a couple of points about the workforce, including the casualisation issue. But just one comment about
it's about this bill, to be clear, so we don't go on a big tangent. I'm asking about the effect of this bill on the workforce.
Yeah, I'll answer that. I'll just respond to that. I mean, one of the reasons why there's a strong alignment between the NDIS and this bill is because we know that our workers work and make choices between the three different care sectors and also the health sector. And so having where we can, having the same conditions, and that includes the screening processes and the code process, prevents the issue about people saying, well, I'm going to go and take my services to another service sector because that appeals to me more. So that's one of the reasons why we're looking at that alignment between care sectors. But as to the other workforce issues, Mr.
Yes, Senator, we've got, I think we're confident that a lot of the other measures that we've announced within the budget are going to provide workers with the support, the training that they need to remain in the sector. We've got a measure that's just about to commence, the Home Care Worker Support Program, which is aimed at providing enough training and support and mentoring to personal care workers to add to that sector, but also to retain them. We've introduced nurses bonuses, which also has particular additional bonuses for nurses working in regional and remote, or who have additional qualifications like specialisation in dementia care. We have introduced the aged care transition to practice program for nurses. We're also looking at ways to boost, to make sure that people who've completed qualifications like Certificate 3 are helped into the aged care sector. So we're doing a project at the moment with the Human Services Skills Organisation to match people who've completed qualifications to aged care providers to make sure that they've got that pathway into work and they're also retained and appropriately supported.
Thank you. We'll go to Senator Rice.
Thank you. Thanks. Look, Senator Green has covered quite a bit of what I was going to cover, so I've got a few follow-up issues. First of all, a bit more details on the timing and the issues with the ANAC at the moment, and certainly in our last session we heard from the allied health professionals about the impact that the uncertainty about ANAC is having on them, and that they're sort of entering into contracts that are basically potentially not being entered into because of that uncertainty and not knowing whether the funding is going to continue to be available for physios and other allied health professionals. So can you just talk me through on what your current expectations are as to when services are going to know for sure how much money they're going to get under the new funding model?
Just a general comment, Senator, that I'm surprised that they would be concerned given the amount of money that's coming in, particularly into residential aged care. I mean, we obviously don't prescribe everyone to get, exactly the same set of services. We're trying to make sure they get services according to their needs, and so we can't guarantee a certain level of income or service to every allied health professional. And I think, I think that kind of...
Health, they're not convinced, and certainly, you've given us assurances that yes, allied health will be covered under the model, but they are not. They've been very concerned that it's not going to be covered. And in fact,
well, I think we've invested some time in talking to allied health professionals, and I think that then has led to public commentary, which is been somewhat misleading, I think. And so it is a bit frustrating, to be honest, to be frank with you. But I think we should concentrate on the model. Obviously comes into play in October 2022.
Correct.
And so there's, I think Mr. Richardson can talk to the two elements that have to be undertaken before providers will know exactly the shape and form of the new system for them.
Sure. So, Senator, we're undertaking what's called shadow assessments at the moment. That's one aspect that Mr. Lai is referring to. The other one is price. Those two things go together for the sector. Providing one and not the other doesn't really provide the sector an indication of the funding level that they will receive under ANAC. Unfortunately, with the COVID-19 lockdowns, New South Wales and Victoria, we're behind with our shadow assessments. The shadow assessments are an important part of that process. We're looking to ensure that we have quality assessments, that the assessments are consistent. So there's a lot of data analysis that we're doing on the assessments as we conduct them. We're also keen on providing the outcomes of those assessments at a national level, rather than drip feeding the sector with assessments as they're undertaken. So we will be providing the assessment outcomes and also the pricing information before, or well before, October 2022, but I don't have a time frame for you or a precise month, Senator.
So, I mean, in the previous session, I asked explicitly in terms of the providers, overall the providers as well as the allied health professionals, as to when was going to be, when they needed that information in order to be able to be planning their 2022-23 financial year budgets. And they said pretty much the very latest February, because that's when they are beginning to shape their budgets for the following financial year. I don't hear you saying
Senator,
that you're going to meet that sort of timetable.
Senator, there's a culture here where providers of all kinds have been in control of this care sector, and they expect to be, running the show. They're not going to run the show. The Royal Commission was very clear about the culture in this sector, which we have to address. I mean, the budget is really clear. The providers do have very, very good signals about the level of investment going forward in residential and home care. And so the idea that they can't frame a budget because there's so much uncertainty, given the high level of uptick in their base funding, I think stretches belief. So we are not, we have a real problem here that we're trying to address in terms of culture, where the consumer's interests have been subordinate to the interests of these providers. And so, I think, I understand they'll have a go on this, and they want to be told everything, and they want to control the pace of reform. But we've got a very clear set of writing instructions, both from the Royal Commission and the government, who's accepted those recommendations, that we need to change things about this sector. And this is one area where we feel very strongly about. And I think, so I don't know that kind of complaint from providers is that much more than self-interest at this point.
I mean, I absolutely understand the need for reform, to be putting the needs and the rights of the clients and the consumers of older Australians at the heart of it. But I don't think it's unreasonable for service providers to be given information to enable them to do their, good practice forward planning.
Sure. No, and look, we are trying to engage them on a very complex set of reforms, and signal to them in every area and consult with them in every area that we're doing work. But I'm not sure about this issue about funding, that they can't frame a budget when, as Mr. Richardson said, the uplift in funding is $7.8 billion, that somehow they think that they're suddenly going to fall over a cliff. It's just not going to happen.
I don't think they're saying that. They're basically saying they want some certainty, and they want to know, what the shape of their budget and the service that they're going to be able to provide is going to be. But look, there's obviously a disagreement between you and them in this issue. So what is your current expectation as to when those providers will be able to have that information of the budget that they are going to be working with for the 2022-23 financial year?
Well, we've got, as Mr. Richardson detailed, the processes we've got to work through. So we aim to put that in their hands as soon as we possibly can, but it's unlikely that it'll be in February next year, given the timetable that we're following. But it will be as soon as possible in advance of that October start.
Will it be before the beginning of the 2022-23 financial year?
Look, Senator, honestly, we cannot say. We're working through methodically both the ANAC shadow assessments and also the pricing work that we've got to do.
Okay. I want to go to the general issues of the introduction of the code and this legislation, which you describe as coat hanger legislation. Again, and you say that this legislation is aligned with the Royal Commission. A summary statement from the aged care collaboration was that, and which was reinforced by a lot of the submissions that we heard this morning, is that the issue that people accept and support the introduction of a code of conduct, but feel that it, to be effective and to be fair, needs to be embedded in a broader framework of training and conditions and pay. The collaboration said the approach outlined in the bill unfortunately does little to advance the more fundamental issue for quality of care, which is the need to upskill and professionalise the personal care workforce. And we've had a lot of submissions basically saying that without that framework, that this code is not going to be achieving its outcomes. So when are we going to be able to have that framework, have the roadmap of what we're doing with increasing the professionalism, with training, with conditions, with pay, that this code will then sit embedded within?
So, Senator, I can't agree with you more about that the specific changes around the code are embedded within a broader policy framework as you describe it. That's absolutely true. And I think we would say that as we're implementing the reforms, the budget package, which was a response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission, that is our guiding framework. And so Ms. Strapp talked to you about some of the workforce measures that we're currently engaged in. We know that the Fair Work Commission is independently considering the issue of wages in the sector. We are looking at the qualifications of our workforce, and there are strategies there to encourage people to gain skills without tipping the balance of having people leave the sector because we go too far too quickly on the skills issue. And so I think together all of those measures that form the budget response to the Royal Commission constitute both legislative and non-legislative activities that are seeking to advance reform. I think that we acknowledge that some of the work that we have done, we have certainly talked with sector leaders about our planning, which sits below that government response, and it is our intention once the Aged Care Advisory Committee is formally constituted to ensure that body has the full detail of those plans and is able to kind of provide a level of guidance to the department in its implementation of the reforms.
So, but in terms of my question is, to me, what's the value of introducing this code given that it's not going to be achieving its outcomes because the outcomes are more fundamental, the issues are more fundamental, they're being addressed in the broader response, and that in fact there are adverse implications of introducing this code in terms of procedural fairness and turning and potentially turning workers away from the sector because of this as being an extra barrier without embedding it into that framework.
Well, Senator, we do see it as embedded. we see a code that's going to be very similar to what we propose operating in the NDIS. Obviously, the scheme there is evolving. We haven't seen a flight of workers from the NDIS because of the presence of a code. And so we don't believe there's issues with procedural fairness in the code. And so, but it is nested within the broader response that we're making to the Royal Commission. And we are moving on all those different fronts at the same time. And we have sought to ensure that our stakeholders have the opportunity to participate in a discussion and understand all of those various elements. We've conducted a number of webinars with all portions of our stakeholder groups, and most particularly families and older Australians, so that they can understand that, you know, it's not just about a series of legislative responses or a code. There's a whole suite of measures that the government has invested in to try and move the sector forward.
And I mean, you have been consulting with them, and you would have heard that hesitation about the concerns of introducing the code in the absence of those the rest of that framework.
Well, look, Senator, I mean, you know, we've got a lot of balls in the air. We're moving a lot of things forward at the same time, and this is one of them. But I mean, if you, you know, I'm constantly reminded of the evidence that was given to the Royal Commission around the quality of services. And so we don't believe that we should delay the implementation of a code of conduct within our sector, because those issues that revolved around the quality of service were so stark during that Royal Commission. And so we don't, you know,
problem, but you've got a problem that's then as to which are the most, you know, the fundamental and the most important parts of the solution, and you've picked on one that.
Well, I think my point is, Senator, that not all the
first, but you're introducing one first, but
yes, but at the same time,
the heart of the problem.
But for example, at the same time, we've implemented additional training for nurses in the aged care sector to upskill their IPC skills and provide leadership. And that's come well before the idea of the code. So, like, it's all those things are happening side by side. They're not happening. This isn't happening in advance of those things.
I think the issue is not, you know, with respect with the nurses and the other professionals who already have codes of conduct that they operate under. It's the carers that can be untrained, you know, incredibly low paid, casualised work. Who are then, you know, potentially going to be through no fault of their own, potentially bearing the burden of penalties and imposition of this code.
Senator, may I just offer a few sentences in response? We've not talked for several paragraphs about providers as employers. Providers employ the workforce, providers offer the orientation and training and the in-service training, and they supervise, and they can terminate. And I just think we need to be careful not to allow providers to step too far back from the limelight here. They're already obliged under the law to comply with the 8 aged care quality standards, one of which is human resources, and goes into the detail of the sufficiency and calibre of the workforce. That's where we start this conversation. The code is additional to that. And from a regulatory standpoint, and I'm sure I don't surprise you when I say this, I'm looking to providers to step up and fulfil their base obligations as employers of staff.
Look, I absolutely and completely agree, and that's the issue in terms of what the obligations are in this legislation for providers to do that stepping up, to actually be providing that environment that the carers can then be doing their best work in, and that this legislation actually doesn't go to that. It provides penalties to the, you know, potentially to workers who are not being appropriately supported or trained by their employers.
And or allows me as the regulator to go straight back to the provider and say, you are employing that worker is struggling, what are you going to do about it?
It's good to hear you say that, but I don't read that in this legislation.
That's certainly my understanding of the way it could operate, and I would be looking to exercise that opportunity as and when required.
Look, finally on this, I want to go to the issue of that these measures like the code and banning orders, as again, it's been put to us, and I'm not sure whether it's explicit and deliberate, that actually aren't going to be required of non-approved providers. In particular, the example of Mabel saying that they're not an employer, they're just a service, and so that they won't have to comply with the provisions that are outlined in this. Could I get your response to that?
So, sorry, Senator, non-approved providers aren't funded by the Commonwealth. So if you're not an approved provider, you won't be receiving, yes, you won't, need to fit with our obligations of code of conduct, but nor do you receive the funding of the Commonwealth.
It's workers, agency workers. So
Senator, you're saying like a RACF might employ somebody using one of those facilities, but they're the employer, they're the approved provider, so they're accountable.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, so so they would be accountable to us because they're the funded entity.
Does that make sense, Senator?
they've just procured a worker from Mabel, but they're still the approved provider and they're receiving the subsidies to pay that worker.
Sorry.
So
Mabel is an employment platform. It is not an approved provider, and I think that's the distinction that the department's trying to do.
Yeah, it's just like using an agency. Well, not just like, but it's similar to procuring a staff member from an agency, but the agency is not the approved provider. The approved provider is the organisation that provides the care for
that we fund
for the resident on there.
And so if they are providing a worker who has not been, I mean, it's then you get into the issue of sort of that arm's length, and they don't necessarily have visibility or control over what training and the quality of that worker that's being provided.
But Senator, I just checked with my colleagues. I understand that worker, having been engaged by the approved provider, so the approved provider would be accountable and the individual worker would be accountable too for the quality of their work. So if they did something wrong, they would be covered.
Okay, look, I'm interested in getting some more feedback on. In fact, if you did have more information about that, and I'll also
we're happy to, Senator.
Some of the other people who have submitted to us.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Rice. And I might just add on that, having been on the NDIS committee, there are unregistered and unregistered providers within the NDIS, which I think is where Mabel often does fit into the service provision. So it would be interesting to understand the clarity around who is exactly provided, because the NDIS does have a slightly different approach to that. So it's possibly worth looking into that. I don't have any further questions. The ones that I had all over my notes here have actually been covered by my colleagues, so I will thank them very much for doing that. And also thank each of you for making your time available this afternoon to appear before us, and look forward to catching up with you again in the future. I don't think we actually had any questions on notice, but if we did, the Secretariat will correct me. And if so, we had questions on answers actually due by close of business tomorrow, because we'll be reporting for this bill next week on the 16th of November. So on that basis, that concludes today's hearing, and on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank all of those who've made submissions to the inquiry and made representatives available today. I'd also like to thank Broadcasting, Hansard and the Secretariat staff for their assistance, and the committee stands adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye.